Long before the world awoke to its heavy sorrows, the mountain held its breath in the cool, silent air. High in the Bavarian Alps, the morning always arrived with a breathtaking gentleness. The mist, cool and silver, would roll down the jagged peaks, curling through the ancient pine trees like a quiet river in the sky. The first light of dawn would touch the snow-capped summits, painting them in soft strokes of pale pink and delicate gold. It was a landscape of profound, indifferent peace. The birds would begin their gentle chorus, the wind would whisper through the branches, and the world outside would slowly, beautifully, come alive. But inside the great house on the hill, the morning did not belong to the sun. Inside the Berghof, the morning was a captive thing, held tightly in the grip of a deep, unnatural slumber. The house was vast, filled with heavy wooden furniture, thick carpets, and sweeping windows designed to capture the majesty of the mountains. Yet, in these early hours, it felt less like a grand estate and more like a tomb. The velvet curtains remained drawn tight against the light, keeping the endless corridors bathed in a soft, twilight gloom. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, floor polish, and the faint, lingering smoke of the previous night's fire. And above all, there was the silence. It was not a restful silence. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, a silence that demanded to be kept. Down in the shadows of the lower floors, the day had already begun for the staff, though you would hardly know it to listen. A quiet army of maids, valets, and kitchen workers moved through the dim halls like phantoms. They wore soft-soled shoes, their footsteps absorbed by the thick wool of the carpets. They communicated in the subtle language of the oppressed, a raised eyebrow, a slight nod, a cautious glance toward the ceiling. Every movement was choreographed to be completely invisible, completely soundless. Imagine a young maid, her apron perfectly crisp, her hands dusted with chalk to keep them dry. She stands before a massive wooden sideboard, holding a soft cloth. Slowly, carefully, she lifts a delicate porcelain teacup, wiping the invisible dust from its rim. Her heart beats a little faster with each dish she touches. In her own home, back in a small, lively village, mornings were a symphony of noise. She remembers the clatter of iron pots, the smell of baking bread, the loud, booming laughter of her father calling out to the neighbors. She remembers the joyful chaos of simply being alive. But here, a dropped spoon is a disaster. A sudden cough is a crime. She sets the teacup down on the saucer with agonizing slowness, letting out a breath she didn't realize she was holding only when the porcelain meets without a sound. She slips a hand into the pocket of her apron, her fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper. It is a letter from her sister, living far away in a city that is growing darker by the day. The letter speaks of simple things, of rationing, of knitting a sweater, of hoping the winter will be mild. Touching the crinkled paper is her only tether to the real world, a quiet act of resilience hidden beneath the starch of her uniform. It reminds her that somewhere, beyond these suffocating walls, ordinary life is still trying to survive. Just outside the heavy oak doors of the master bedroom, the guards stand like statues carved from the mountain stone. They are young men, trained for movement, for action, yet here they are tasked with the grueling labor of absolute stillness. The hours stretch out before them, an endless, silent desert. They stare straight ahead at the textured wallpaper, their eyes tracing the same patterns over and over again until the shapes blur. They shift their weight so slowly, so imperceptibly, that it takes minutes to move from one foot to the other. In the quiet of their minds, they escape. One guard closes his eyes for a fraction of a second and thinks of a quiet river where he used to fish as a boy, the water babbling softly over smooth, round stones. Another thinks of the warmth of a girl's hand in his, a memory of a summer evening that feels like it belongs to another lifetime. They wrap themselves in these fragile, beautiful memories, building quiet fortresses inside their heads to withstand the crushing weight of the present. They are protectors of a sleeping shadow, but in the silence, their own humanity quietly, stubbornly, refuses to fade. Further down the hall, in the anterooms and drawing rooms, the absurd theater of the morning continues. Powerful men, ministers, generals, men who held the fates of millions in their leather briefcases, sit on plush sofas, waiting. They are reduced to the status of nervous children outside a headmaster's office. They sip endless cups of tepid coffee, poured by silent servants. They do not dare to speak above a whisper. They do not dare to rattle their papers or clear their throats. They lean in close to one another, exchanging hushed words that vanish into the heavy air. The grand machinery of an empire, the terrible gears of a continent in turmoil, all grind to a halt because the man upstairs refuses to greet the dawn. The waiting men look at the grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner. The pendulum swings back and forth, slicing the morning into quiet ribbons. 9 o'clock. 10 o'clock. 11 o'clock. The morning slips away, wasted, poured out into the void of one man's dreams. Down in the kitchen, the tension is a physical weight. The cooks work with a meticulous, anxious grace. Water is boiled, then set aside, then boiled again, always kept at the perfect temperature, just in case the moment arrives. Trays of simple, ascetic food are prepared, covered, and discarded when too much time has passed, only to be prepared once more. The rhythm of the kitchen, usually the beating heart of any large house, is here a strange, stuttering pulse. An older woman, her hand scarred from years of labor, carefully slices an apple. She cuts it into thin, perfect crescents. She works with the quiet dignity of someone who takes pride in her craft, even when the circumstances are surreal. She does not look up at the ceiling. She focuses only on the blade, the fruit, the gentle curve of the peel falling to the cutting board. She has learned that survival here means shrinking your world down to the space between your hands. You do the small task in front of you. You find a quiet harbor in the work itself. You slice the apple. You arrange the plate. You do not think about the man who will eat it. As the morning creeps toward midday, the light outside begins to change. The soft, forgiving gold of the sunrise hardens into the bright, unyielding white of noon. The mist burns away from the pine trees, revealing the sharp, jagged edges of the mountains against a brilliant blue sky. The world outside is wide awake, rushing forward, living and breathing in the light. Inside the Berghof, the light finally begins to penetrate the edges of the heavy curtains, casting long, thin beams across the polished floors. Dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight, spinning in the silent air. The house seems to brace itself. The atmosphere shifts, growing tighter, thinner. The staff move a little faster, their eyes darting toward the main staircase. The waiting men in the anteroom sit up a little straighter, smoothing their tunics, touching the edges of their collars. The silence, which had been a heavy blanket all morning, now feels like a drawn bowstring, pulled back to its absolute limit. Every ear is strained. Every breath is shallow. And then, it happens. A faint sound from the upper floor. The muffled thud of footsteps on a thick rug. The creak of floorboards adjusting to a sudden weight. The heavy, metallic click of a brass door handle slowly turning. The sound ripples down the staircase, flowing through the corridors, into the drawing rooms, and down into the kitchen. It is the sound of the spell breaking. The long, stolen morning is over. The staff lower their eyes, their hands moving quickly to their sides. The guards snap to an even more rigid attention. The young maid with the letter in her pocket takes a deep, silent breath, feeling the crinkle of the paper one last time before letting her hand fall away. The peace of the morning, the quiet hours where the mountain was allowed to simply be a mountain, are gone. The shadow has woken, and the terrifying machinery of the day must finally, relentlessly, begin. The forest swallows every sound, turning the afternoon into a cathedral of shadows and damp, green moss. When the heavy doors of the Berghof finally opened to the afternoon air, the world outside was already softening, the sun beginning its slow, golden descent toward the peaks of the Bavarian Alps. The day's grueling, silent morning had passed, replaced now by a new ritual, one just as meticulously choreographed and just as strangely quiet. This was the time for the walk. The air up here was thin and sweet, smelling intensely of pine needles, cold earth, and the distant, metallic promise of snow. The light filtered down through the dense canopy of ancient spruce and fir trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the winding gravel paths. It was a beautiful place, a quiet place, a landscape that seemed to demand peace from anyone who walked within it. The gravel crunched, a slow, rhythmic sound breaking the profound stillness. Step. Pause. Step. The man walked with a heavy wooden cane, his gaze often fixed on the ground or wandering aimlessly into the middle distance. Sometimes, a small, quiet entourage followed a few paces behind, a secretary, an adjutant, perhaps a guest, but they were invisible in spirit, forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, forbidden from walking too close. They were merely shadows trailing behind a larger shadow, trapped within an invisible bubble of absolute, impenetrable isolation. Inside this bubble, the world was small and perfectly controlled. There was no war here, no suffering, no crumbling cities or frightened children. There were only the names of wildflowers to be murmured, the shape of a peculiar cloud to be noticed, the gentle incline of the path to be conquered. The man would pause, pointing a trembling, gloved finger at a blue gentian pushing through the rocky soil, and the followers would nod in hushed, polite agreement. It was an illusion so profound, so fiercely maintained, that it felt as fragile as spun glass. One sharp word, one unexpected noise, could shatter it completely. And so, to protect this fragile illusion of a solitary man communing with the majestic mountains, the woods themselves had to be tamed. If you were to stand on that path and look into the trees, you would see nothing but trunks, branches, and the deep, mysterious gloom of the forest. But the woods were not empty. They were breathing. They were watching. Dozens of men were hidden within the tree line, scattered along the entire length of the winding path. They were guards, but they were not there to stand tall and show their strength. They were ordered to be ghosts. The dictator demanded the feeling of being entirely alone in nature, undisturbed by the sight of uniforms or weapons. And so, these young men were forced to become part of the forest itself, blending into the bark, sinking into the moss, erasing their own existence so that one man might feel at peace. Imagine a young man, hardly out of his teens, standing behind the thick, rough trunk of an ancient oak tree. The ground beneath his heavy boots is soft and damp, soaking a slow chill into his toes. He has been standing there for 2 hours before the walk even began. He is not allowed to shift his weight. He is not allowed to cough, to clear his throat, to brush away the gnats that circle his eyes. A small, iridescent green beetle lands on the back of his hand. It crawls slowly across his knuckles, its tiny, tickling legs exploring the landscape of his skin. The young guard watches it. He breathes in a shallow, silent breath through his nose. He does not shake the beetle away. In the agonizing stillness, he finds a strange comfort in this tiny, living creature. It reminds him of his grandmother's garden, of warm summer afternoons spent turning over stones just to see what lived beneath them. He remembers the smell of turned earth, the rich, dark scent of life, and the soft, wrinkled hands of his grandmother offering him a piece of fresh fruit. He holds onto that memory like a lifeline. He builds a quiet sanctuary in his mind, a place where he is a boy again, safe and warm, far away from this cold mountain and the terrible weight of the silence. As the slow crunch of gravel approaches on the path, the true anxiety begins. The guards must remain unseen. If the walking man turns his head, if he glances into the woods, he must see only nature. So, as the footsteps draw near, the hidden men must perform a slow, terrifying dance. They pivot around the trunks of the trees, inch by silent inch, keeping the wood between themselves and the man on the path. Their boots press carefully into the moss, feeling for hidden twigs or dry leaves that might snap. A single, sharp crack of a breaking branch would be a disaster. It would tear the fabric of the illusion. Another guard, further up the winding trail, stands with his back pressed hard against a towering pine. The rough bark bites through his tunic, but he doesn't feel it. His mind is thousands of miles away. Deep in the pocket of his trousers, his fingers are wrapped around a small, smooth piece of wood. It is a little horse he has been carving for his daughter. With his thumb, he traces the curve of the horse's neck, the small, rounded ears he spent hours sanding down so they wouldn't splinter in her small hands. He can almost see her face, lit by the glow of a hearth fire, her eyes widening with delight as she traces those same curves. He clings to that image. As the heavy, dragging footsteps pass by his tree, he squeezes the wooden horse tightly. He is a ghost in the woods, a man erased from the landscape, but in his heart, he is a father. His love is a quiet, stubborn flame that the damp forest cannot extinguish. It is his everyday heroism, his private rebellion against the darkness, to stand in the shadows of a tyrant and think only of a child's smile. The procession moves on, a slow, creeping phantom winding its way up toward the Muslanarkov tea house. The tea house sits perfectly positioned on a ledge, offering a sweeping, breathtaking view of the valley below. Here, the mountains look like sleeping giants, draped in cloaks of emerald and sapphire. At the tea house, more staff are waiting. They have been waiting all afternoon, standing by tables covered in pristine white linen. The silver teapots are polished until they gleam like mirrors. The cakes are arranged with mathematical precision. The staff here, too, hold their breath. They watch the path, waiting for the shadow to arrive. When he finally sits on the wooden bench, looking out over the vast and different beauty of the Alps, the world seems to pause. The staff pour the tea, the delicate liquid falling into the cups without a single splash. They offer the plates with bowed heads, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground. They are grateful for the sheer scale of the mountains, hoping that the staggering view will keep the man's attention directed outward, away from them. The wind picks up, whistling softly through the wooden eaves of the tea house. It carries the scent of distant rain. For a long, surreal moment, everything is peaceful. The teacups clink softly. The birds call to one another across the valley. The dictator sits, a small figure against the immense, ancient backdrop of the stone, sipping his warm drink while a continent trembles beneath his feet. The disconnect is so profound it makes the air feel dizzying, but the staff merely stare at the linen tablecloths, focusing on the intricate patterns woven into the fabric. They survive by noticing the small things. The weave of the cotton. The reflection in a silver spoon. They keep their minds tethered to the gentle, the simple, the mundane. Eventually, the cup is emptied. The cane is lifted. The walk must resume, the journey back down the winding path to the heavy, waiting doors of the Berghof. The descent is just as slow, just as quiet. The hidden guards in the trees prepare themselves once more, ready to pivot around the trunks, ready to hold their breath until their lungs ache. They hear the approaching steps, the soft murmur of polite, meaningless conversation passing by. And then, the footsteps fade. The voices disappear around the bend. The heavy doors in the distance open and close with a muffled, final thud. The bubble has drifted away. Slowly, carefully, the forest begins to exhale. A guard steps out from behind his oak tree, rolling his stiff shoulders, his joints popping softly in the quiet air. The young man with the wooden horse pulls his hand from his pocket and wipes his damp brow. They do not speak to one another. There is no need for words. They simply stand for a moment in the clearing, letting the tension drain away into the earth. The birds, which had grown quiet as the procession passed, begin to sing again, their voices clear and bright in the fading afternoon light. A squirrel darts across the gravel path, completely unaware of the heavy boots that had just walked there. The forest reclaims its space. The men look up at the sky, watching the clouds turn a soft, bruised purple as evening approaches. They have survived another day of holding up the illusion. They turn and begin the long walk back to their barracks, their steps finally their own, moving quietly through the beautiful, indifferent woods, carrying their private hopes and quiet memories safely back into the approaching night. In the warmth of the firelight, time did not merely pass, it gathered like heavy, velvet dust, settling softly over everyone in the room. As the pale afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, a new, inescapable ritual began inside the great house. The long walk was over, the heavy doors were closed against the chill, and the grand hall was bathed in the soft, flickering glow of the hearth. This was the hour of tea. To an outsider, it might have looked like a scene of profound comfort. The room was vast but deeply cushioned, filled with plush, oversized armchairs and thick woolen rugs that swallowed every footstep. The great, sweeping window offered a painting of the twilight Alps, a masterpiece of purple shadows and fading silver light. But within this luxurious warmth, the air was impossibly heavy. It was a golden cage, and the daily gathering for tea was a quiet, agonizing sentence that had to be served. From the shadows of the corridor, the gentle rattle of the tea cart announced the beginning of the ordeal. The servants pushed it forward with aching slowness, terrified of a squeaky wheel or a clinking saucer. The cart was a towering display of sweetness, a stark, surreal contrast to the grim realities of the world outside. There were towering apple cakes dusted with fine, powdery sugar, rich chocolate torts glistening under the lamps, and delicate, crumbling pastries filled with sweet cream. The smell of roasted coffee and steeped leaves filled the room, rich and inviting. Yet, for the men and women taking their seats in the soft armchairs, these sweets were not a comfort. They were an obligation. The inner circle, the private secretaries, the adjutants, the personal physicians, and occasionally the weary wives of high-ranking officials, took their places with the slow, deliberate movements of people stepping into a deep, slow-moving river. They knew what was coming. They arranged their skirts, smoothed their trousers, and folded their hands in their laps. They were about to be held captive, not by iron bars, but by the relentless, looping stream of one man's voice. The dictator would sit in his favorite chair near the fire, a teacup resting delicately in his hand, and he would begin to speak. And he would not stop. He did not converse, he delivered monologues. The topics were always the same, a spinning carousel of old memories and rigid obsessions. He would talk for hours about the architecture of cities he wished to rebuild, drawing invisible lines in the air with his pastry fork. He would speak of his days as a young man in Vienna, of the operas he had seen, of the diets he believed would purify the body. The voice was not a shout in these hours, it was a steady, droning murmur, a hypnotic, inescapable rhythm that filled every corner of the vast room. For the listeners, the struggle was entirely internal, a quiet, desperate battle fought behind polite smiles and attentively tilted heads. Imagine a young secretary, sitting perfectly upright on the edge of a deep sofa. The fire radiates an intense, comforting heat that wraps around her like a heavy blanket. She has been working since the early hours, typing endless pages of dictation, and her body is crying out for rest. The soft, monotonous voice washing over her acts like a lullaby, a dangerous, forbidden lullaby. Her eyelids feel as though they are made of lead. She takes a tiny, deliberate bite of her apple cake, hoping the sharp sweetness will jolt her awake, but it only settles heavily in her stomach. She knows that to close her eyes, even for a moment, is an unforgivable offense. To yawn is a crime. So, she fights a silent war. She pinches the soft skin of her own wrist, hiding her hand beneath the folds of her woolen skirt. She presses her fingernails into her palm until it hurts, using the small, sharp pain as an anchor to keep herself from drifting away. She lowers her gaze to the porcelain teacup trembling slightly in her hand. It is a beautiful thing, bone-white and impossibly thin, painted with tiny, intricate blue flowers. She stares at the painted petals until they blur. In the quiet sanctuary of her mind, she climbs inside that teacup. She imagines herself shrinking down, stepping into the painted blue garden, away from the heavy furniture, away from the droning voice, away from the suffocating expectations. She thinks of her mother's garden back home, where the flowers were real and smelled of damp earth and sunshine. She remembers the sound of the wind chimes on the back porch, a random, joyful music so different from the rigid, controlled atmosphere of this mountain fortress. She holds on to that memory, nurturing it like a small flame, her quiet defiance against the crushing weight of the room. Across from her sits an older man, an adjutant who has spent years perfecting the art of the waking sleep. He sits with his back straight, his eyes fixed politely on the speaker's chin. To the casual observer, he is the picture of rapt attention. He nods at precisely the right moments. He offers a small, agreeable murmur when a pause seems to demand it. But behind his unblinking eyes, his mind is miles away. He is mentally writing a letter to his wife. He composes the sentences slowly, choosing every word with care. He tells her about the crisp mountain air, carefully omitting the suffocating tension of the house. He imagines her reading the letter at their small kitchen table, the morning sun catching the silver strands in her hair. He pictures the worn wood of the table, the chipped mug she always drinks from, the comforting, messy reality of a life lived simply. The droning voice in the room becomes nothing more than the sound of distant rain against a window pane, something to be ignored while he builds a fortress of love and longing inside his own head. As the hours stretch on, the physical toll of the forced relaxation becomes an ache in the bones. The tea grows cold in the delicate cups. The chocolate cake turns dry on the silver plates. The light outside the great window fades completely, leaving the room illuminated only by the warm, deceptive glow of the lamps and the dying embers of the fire. The silence of the listeners is profound. It is a heavy, collective endurance. You can feel the tension in the way they hold their breath, releasing it only in slow, controlled increments. When someone needs to shift their weight to ease an aching back, they do it over the course of minutes, moving a fraction of an inch at a time so as not to draw the eye, so as not to break the spell of the monologue. A stifled yawn is a terrifying thing. It begins deep in the chest, a sudden, desperate demand for oxygen. The throat tightens, the jaw aches to open, the eyes water. The captive listener must swallow it down, pressing their lips tightly together, forcing the yawn to die silently in the back of their throat. A single tear might escape, rolling down the cheek, hastily brushed away under the guise of rubbing an itchy eye. The servants, standing motionless by the heavy oak doors, watch the quiet agony of the room with a complex mixture of pity and relief. A maid, standing with a silver tray pressed against her white apron, observes the powerful people trapped in their plush chairs. She sees the exhaustion etched into the corners of their eyes. She sees the rigid, unnatural stillness of their bodies. In her village, tea time meant laughter. It meant neighbors dropping by, voices talking over one another, the clatter of spoons, and the sharing of neighborhood gossip. It was a time to exhale. Here, it is a time to hold one's breath. As she watches the exhausted secretary pinch her own wrist, the maid feels a sudden, profound gratitude for her own invisibility. Because she is a servant, because she is considered unimportant, she is not required to sit and listen. She is free to let her mind wander as she waits by the door. She is free to eventually walk away, down into the lower halls, where she can speak in a normal voice, where she can let her shoulders drop. The people in the soft chairs have power, she realizes, but they have no freedom. They are prisoners of the very man they serve, chained to his voice by their own ambition and fear. The grandfather clock in the corner of the hall ticks with a slow, agonizing rhythm. It is the only other sound in the room, a steady heartbeat measuring out the stolen afternoon. Tick. Tock. Every swing of the brass pendulum is a small victory, 1 second closer to the end. The listeners focus on that sound, letting it ground them, praying for the moment the voice will finally falter. And eventually, it does. Sometimes, it is simply a long pause that stretches until the silence becomes absolute. Sometimes, the dictator simply stares into the dying fire, lost in some impenetrable thought, and waves a dismissive hand. The spell breaks. The invisible chains dissolve. The relief in the room is palpable, though it is expressed only in whispers. The listeners rise from their chairs, their joints stiff, their bodies aching from the sheer effort of staying still. They do not stretch. They do not sigh aloud. They offer polite, hushed bows and quiet murmurs of good evening. They file out of the great hall like ghosts returning to the mist, moving quickly toward the sanctuary of their own small rooms. As they close their bedroom doors behind them, the masks finally drop. Shoulders slump. Deep, shuddering breaths are finally taken. The exhaustion washes over them like a dark tide. Back in the grand hall, the fire is reduced to glowing orange ash. The room is silent once more. The servants move in quickly, silently, collecting the wreckage of the afternoon. They gather the plates of untouched cake. They lift the delicate porcelain teacups, leaving small, wet rings on the polished wood. The teacups are cold now, the delicate blue flowers staring blindly up at the ceiling. The ritual is over, but the quiet, heavy endurance of the mountain will begin all over again tomorrow. When the world outside grew too dark to bear, the dictator built a universe of light within a single, windowless room. As night descended over the mountains, sealing the great house in a shroud of impenetrable blackness, a profound shift occurred within its heavy stone walls. The grueling hours of dictation were finished. The maps, covered in their silent, terrifying arrows, were rolled away. The sprawling blueprints of impossible cities were folded back into their wooden drawers. The relentless, waking hours of the day had finally exhausted themselves. Now, the inhabitants of the house moved with a different kind of quiet, not the anxious stillness of the morning, but the hollow, desperate quiet of people seeking an escape they could never truly afford. Deep in the heart of the building, isolated from the chilling winds that howled across the alpine peaks, lay the cinema room. It was a sanctuary lined with rich, crimson velvet, heavy tapestries, and deep, upholstered chairs that seemed to swallow whoever sat in them. The air down here was perpetually warm, carrying the faint, sweet scent of warm dust, polished brass, and the unmistakable, sharp tang of celluloid film. High up in the back wall, hidden away in a cramped, narrow booth, stood the projectionist. He was a quiet man, a man whose entire life was measured in frames per second, in the gentle, rhythmic clicking of spools, and in the careful threading of delicate ribbons of light. In the grand, terrifying hierarchy of the house, he was a ghost. He wore a simple, dark sweater, his hands forever stained with a faint trace of machine oil. Yet, in this narrow booth, for 2 hours every single night, he held absolute power over reality. He stood before the massive, iron-bodied projector, gently wiping a soft cloth over its glass lens. The machine was a beautiful, complicated beast of gears and sprockets. He loved the cold touch of the metal, the logical, predictable way the wheels turned. Out there, beyond the heavy walls of the compound, the world had lost all logic. It had fractured into chaos and sorrow. But in his small booth, everything made sense. If you threaded the film correctly, if you maintained the arc of the lamp, the machine would reliably spin a perfect, self-contained world onto the far wall. Through the thick, soundproof glass portal of his booth, he watched the audience begin to file in. They looked like sleepwalkers entering a dream. The private secretaries arrived first, their shoulders slumped under the weight of the secrets they had typed all day. They took their seats near the back, sinking into the velvet, their eyes already hungry for the blank screen. Then came the adjutants, the doctors, the silent guards, all shedding the rigid posture of their daylight duties. They spoke in hushed whispers, not out of fear, but out of a shared, fragile reverence for the temporary peace that was about to begin. Finally, the shadow himself entered, taking his designated seat in the front row. The room fell into an absolute, breathless silence. The projectionist waited for the subtle nod from below. When it came, he took a slow, calming breath and threw the heavy electrical switch. The projector roared to life with a deep, comforting hum. The carbon arc lamp ignited with a blinding flash, a captive miniature sun burning inside its metal housing. The projectionist released the brake on the spools, and the celluloid began to spin. Click, 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 click. The sound was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the small booth. A brilliant beam of white light shot out from the lens, cutting through the darkness of the theater. It caught millions of tiny dust motes in the air, turning them into a swirling galaxy of floating, golden stars before splashing against the silver screen. Suddenly, the heavy walls of the mountain fortress vanished. In their place, a glittering, frivolous fantasy sprang to life. It was almost never a film of consequence. There were no newsreels here, no stark documentaries of the crumbling world outside. The dictator demanded only illusions. He demanded sweeping romances set in distant, untouched valleys. He demanded light-hearted comedies, beautiful dancers tapping across mirrored floors, and singers performing beneath painted, smiling moons. The projectionist rested his hands on the cool metal of the machine, looking down through his little glass window at the surreal tableau below. The contrast was so vast, so bizarre, that it sometimes made his head spin. He looked at the face of the man in the front row, illuminated by the flickering, dancing light of a romantic comedy. He saw the harsh lines of the dictator's face soften in the silver glow. He watched the man lean back, captivated by the trivial troubles of actors on a screen, occasionally letting out a dry, rattling laugh at a simple joke. And then, the projectionist would look beyond the dictator, looking to the other faces in the dark. He watched a young secretary in the third row. In the pale blue light of the film, she looked incredibly young, like a schoolgirl watching a matinee on a Sunday afternoon. For a few precious moments, the deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes seemed to vanish. She was watching a beautiful woman in a lavish gown sweep across a ballroom floor, and for just a second, the secretary's lips parted in a quiet, genuine smile. She had forgotten the letters she had typed that morning. She had forgotten the frightening silence of the long afternoon tea. She was simply a girl, lost in a story, carried away by the music and the light. The projectionist felt a sudden, deep ache of sympathy for her. He knew that she, like him, was just a small, fragile piece of wood caught in a terrible, swirling river. He wanted to keep the projector running forever, to keep the film spinning so that she would never have to wake up and remember where she really was. He turned his gaze away from the glass and looked down at his own small workspace. Beside the spare spools of film, tucked half beneath a metal tin, was a small, creased photograph. It was a picture of his wife, standing in front of a bakery in a city far away. The edges of the photograph were worn soft from how many times he had touched it. He reached out and traced the outline of her smile with his grease-stained thumb. He wondered if she was safe tonight. He wondered if she was looking up at the sky, listening for the sirens, or if she was managing to sleep. In his mind, he spoke to her. He told her that he was safe, hidden away in a warm room, spinning fairy tales out of light and shadow. He told her that he was trying to hold onto his own soul by focusing on the simple, honest work of his hands. He threaded the film, he adjusted the focus, he monitored the carbon rods, all for her. His quiet resilience was built into the very rhythm of his machine. Every click of the celluloid was a second survived, a second closer to seeing her again. As the first reel neared its end, a familiar, quiet anxiety gripped the projectionist. He had to make the changeover perfectly. If the screen went dark for even a second, if the fantasy was interrupted, the spell would be broken. The harsh reality of the room would rush back in, and the dictator's temper would flare. The projectionist moved with the fluid grace of a dancer. He watched the small, barely visible cue marks flash in the upper right corner of the screen. 1. 2. He ignited the lamp on the second projector. He rested his hand on the changeover lever. 3. He pulled the lever. The picture seamlessly shifted from one machine to the other, the audio carrying over without a single pop or hiss. Down below, the audience didn't even blink. The illusion held. The projectionist exhaled a long, shaky breath, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. The booth was growing hot, the smell of melting ozone heavy in the enclosed space. He quickly rewound the finished reel, the film spinning backward with a soft, whispering hiss, safely returning the spent fantasy to its metal tin. As the second hour drew to a close, the mood in the theater began to subtly shift. The film was building toward its grand, joyful finale. The music swelled through the hidden speakers, reaching a crescendo of triumph and romantic resolution. The lovers on the screen embraced, the painted sun began to rise behind them, and the words "the end" faded gracefully into view. For a few seconds, the screen remained white, casting a harsh, unblinking glare over the faces of the audience. The projectionist quickly pulled the dimmer switch, and the house lights began to slowly, agonizingly rise. The magic was gone. The velvet chairs were just chairs again. The room was just a bunker hidden within a mountain. The audience blinked in the returning light, looking around as if they had just been abruptly awakened from a deep sleep. The faces that had been soft and relaxed only moments before instantly hardened, the masks of duty and fear slipping firmly back into place. The young secretary lowered her head, the heavy exhaustion settling back onto her shoulders like a physical weight. The dictator stood up without a word. He did not look back. He simply walked toward the heavy wooden doors, surrounded by his invisible bubble once more. The rest of the audience followed, shuffling quietly out of the cinema, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. They were returning to their small, lonely rooms, to face the quiet terror of the sleepless night, waiting for the grueling cycle to begin all over again. Up in the booth, the projectionist stood alone. He turned off the heavy arc lamps, and the deep, comforting hum of the machine slowly died away. The only sound left was the quiet clicking of the metal as it cooled. He gently unthreaded the final reel of film, winding the celluloid smoothly back onto its core. He placed the film into its tin case and pressed the lid down until it snapped tight, locking the beautiful, frivolous world away in the dark. He gathered his soft cloths, wiped down the lenses one last time, and packed away his tools. Before he turned off the small desk lamp, he touched the photograph of his wife one more time. He whispered a quiet goodnight to her image. Then, he clicked off the light. He stepped out of the booth and walked down the narrow stairs, stepping into the empty, silent theater. The air still smelled faintly of the illusion, but the shadows had reclaimed the silver screen. The projectionist walked alone through the quiet corridors of the sleeping house, an invisible man carrying the secret of the light, surviving the darkness one frame at a time. To walk through a house built for giants is to understand the quiet terror of being very, very small. Far from the damp, whispering pines of the mountain retreat, the heart of the empire beat with a different, colder rhythm. In the center of the city, rising from the streets like a sheer cliff face of stone and glass, stood the new seat of power. It was a building not designed for living, nor for working, but for overwhelming the human soul. The sweeping facades and towering columns were carved from heavy, unforgiving stone. It was a fortress of illusion, built to cast a long, freezing shadow over anyone who dared to approach its heavy bronze doors. Inside, the silence was different from the peaceful quiet of the alpine woods. This was a manufactured silence. It was the breathless, echoing hush of a tomb waiting for its king. Imagine a young clerk, a boy really, whose suit jacket is just a fraction too wide at the shoulders. His name does not matter to the grand sweep of history, his name only matters to the mother who kissed his cheek that morning before he walked out into the gray city air. He stands at the beginning of an impossible hallway, a leather folder pressed tightly against his chest. Inside the folder are papers. They are not declarations of war, nor are they the fates of nations. They are mundane, beautifully typed schedules, lists of mundane appointments, and requisition forms for ordinary things. Yet, to this young clerk, holding this folder feels like carrying a pane of fragile glass across a frozen lake. He takes a breath. The air in the corridor smells of floor wax, old leather, and the faint, metallic scent of polished brass. It is completely sterile, completely devoid of the messy, beautiful scent of human life. He takes his first step. Click. The sound of his leather shoe striking the polished stone floor rings out like a gunshot in a canyon. The corridor is impossibly long, stretching out into a distant, hazy vanishing point. The floor is made of deep, blood-red marble, polished to such a blinding sheen that it reflects the towering, ornate ceiling above. As the boy walks, he feels as though he is suspended in midair, floating helplessly between a cold, stone sky and a deep, frozen sea. Click. Clack. Click. He tries to walk softly. He tries to roll his steps from heel to toe, willing his feet to be silent, but the architecture will not allow it. The building was designed specifically to amplify the footsteps of the solitary visitor. It was designed to make a man listen to the small, pathetic sound of his own approach, to make him feel exposed, isolated, and entirely at the mercy of the vast space around him. The boy feels the weight of the towering walls pressing in on his shoulders. He feels the terrifying emptiness of the air above his head. To survive the walk, he has to retreat inward. As his shoes echo down the endless, gleaming hall, he closes his eyes for just a fraction of a second and builds a quiet room inside his mind. He thinks of the small apartment he shares with his mother, nestled under the sloping eaves of a soot-stained building across the city. The ceiling there is so low that a tall man would have to bow his head. To the architects of this grand marble hall, that small apartment would be a miserable, cramped box. But to the boy, it is a sanctuary. He thinks of the peeling wallpaper in the kitchen, patterned with faded yellow flowers. He remembers the warmth radiating from the small iron stove, and the deeply comforting smell of boiling potatoes and warm salt. He remembers the way the floorboards creak, not with a terrifying echo, but with a familiar, gentle groan that simply says, "You are home." He slips his free hand into the pocket of his trousers. His fingers find a small, smooth object. It is a wooden button, worn soft at the edges, which had fallen off his late grandfather's winter coat. He carries it with him every day. In this cavernous hall, surrounded by thousands of square feet of perfectly cut stone, this tiny, imperfect piece of wood is his anchor. He rubs his thumb over its surface, drawing warmth from the memory of his grandfather's hearty, booming laugh, a sound that would have shattered the icy perfection of this marble corridor in an instant. The love he holds for his family is a quiet, glowing ember keeping his spirit warm in the freezing shadow of power. He continues to walk. The walls are lined with massive, towering windows that look out onto a stark, manicured courtyard. The light that filters through the heavy glass is pale and gray, offering no warmth. Beside each window, standing at perfect, mathematical intervals, are the guards. They are dressed in immaculate, dark uniforms, their boots polished to a mirror shine, their gloved hands resting perfectly at their sides. They do not move. They do not blink. They are expected to be extensions of the architecture, pillars of flesh and bone holding up the heavy atmosphere of the room. As the young clerk walks past the first guard, he keeps his eyes fixed straight ahead, terrified of making contact. But as he passes the third guard, a sudden, unexpected thing happens. The boy's shoe catches slightly on a microscopic seam in the marble. He stumbles, just for a fraction of a second, his shoulder dipping, the leather folder slipping an inch in his damp hands. His heart leaps into his throat. He catches his balance instantly, a flush of hot, prickly shame rising to his cheeks. He dares to glance to his right, toward the guard standing motionless by the window. The guard's face is locked in a mask of stern, terrifying indifference. But for a single, fleeting second, the guard's eyes shift. They meet the boy's terrified gaze. And in those eyes, there is no anger. There is only a quiet, gentle understanding. The guard cannot smile. He cannot speak. But in that microscopic shifting of his gaze, a silent conversation takes place. It is a sudden, breathtaking flash of humanity bridging the terrifying gulf between them. The guard's eyes seem to say, "I know. I am just a boy in a uniform, pretending to be a statue. You are just a boy in a suit, terrified of the echo of your own feet. We are both just trying to survive the quiet terror of this room." The moment passes as quickly as a shadow cast by a flying bird. The guard's eyes snap back to the empty horizon. But the clerk feels a sudden, profound easing of the tightness in his chest. He is not entirely alone in the marble cavern. There is another beating heart here, hiding behind a mask of stone. The clerk tightens his grip on his folder, his fingers still brushing against the wooden button in his pocket, and continues his march. He finally reaches the end of the long gallery. Before him stand the towering, heavy doors that lead to the inner sanctum. They are framed in dark, polished wood and flanked by more silent sentries. The air here is so thick with tension it feels difficult to breathe. This is the center of the labyrinth. The boy stops a few feet from the doors. He is not permitted to knock. He is not permitted to touch the heavy bronze handles. He must simply stand and wait. The silence now is absolute. The echo of his footsteps has faded away, absorbed into the vast ceiling. He waits, listening to the thumping of his own pulse rushing in his ears. He focuses on his breathing, taking shallow, silent sips of air. He imagines himself as a very small, very gray mouse, wishing only to scurry into the skirting board and disappear. After what feels like an eternity, one of the heavy doors opens with a soft, expensive sigh. An older man steps out. He is an adjutant, his face pale and drawn, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with deep, purple shadows of exhaustion. He moves with a slow, deliberate caution, like a man walking through a room filled with sleeping wolves. The young clerk steps forward and bows his head slightly. He extends his arms, offering the leather folder. The older man takes it. Their fingers brush for a second. The older man's hand is cold and trembling slightly. He looks at the young clerk, and for a moment, the mask of the high official slips. He looks at the boy with a profound, weary sadness. He sees the youth, the innocence, the simple, ordinary life that the boy represents, a life the older man has long since traded away for a place in this beautiful, terrifying prison. "Thank you," the older man whispers. The voice is so soft it barely disturbs the dust in the air. He steps back behind the heavy doors, and they close with a soft, final click. The delivery is complete. The burden is lifted. The young clerk turns around to face the impossibly long marble gallery once more. But the walk back is different. The heavy, invisible weight that had been pressing down on his shoulders is gone. He is no longer walking toward the center of the web, he is walking away from it. His footsteps still echo, but they no longer sound like a threat. They sound like a countdown. Every step is a step closer to the heavy front doors, closer to the street, closer to the messy, chaotic, beautiful world of ordinary men. He passes the guard by the window again, and though neither of them looks at the other, the clerk feels a quiet wave of gratitude for the silent boy in the dark uniform. When the clerk finally pushes through the heavy bronze doors and steps out onto the stone steps of the building, the cold, damp evening air of the city hits his face like a blessing. The sky above is a bruised, twilight gray. The streetlights are beginning to flicker on, casting warm, blurry halos in the mist. He hears the distant rumble of a tram. He hears the faint, muffled sound of a bicycle bell ringing on a side street. He hears the quiet, rhythmic shuffling of ordinary people walking home from work, their heads down against the evening chill, carrying loaves of bread wrapped in brown paper, thinking only of their warm fires and their waiting families. The clerk takes a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the chaotic, living air of the city. He pulls his coat tight against the wind, his hand resting comfortably on the small wooden button in his pocket. He steps down into the street, blending into the shadows of the evening, walking away from the towering, silent halls of marble, back toward the simple, enduring warmth of the human world. In the deepest hours of the night, when the real world was too fractured to look at, it was much easier to build the perfect, tiny one out of paper and wood. Long after the heavy bronze doors of the great buildings had been locked against the damp wind, and long after the nervous clerks had hurried home through the shadowed streets, a different kind of quiet settled over the architectural study. This room was a sanctuary of straight lines, flawless geometry, and impossible dreams. It did not smell of the heavy, tense fear that choked the rest of the building. Instead, it smelled of sharpened graphite, rich parchment, and the sweet, dry scent of basswood and warm glue. Here, under the golden, pooling glow of a dozen brass desk lamps, the chaos of a trembling continent was completely erased. The sweeping tables that dominated the center of the room were not covered in military maps or casualty reports. They were covered in pristine, sprawling blueprints and breathtaking miniature cities carved from snow-white plaster. When the dictator entered this room, his shoulders, usually tight with the burden of his own terrible designs, seemed to slightly uncoil. He did not speak in the harsh, sharp tones of the daylight hours. He moved slowly, his eyes catching the light of the lamps as he leaned over the heavy wooden tables. He was stepping out of a reality he could no longer control, and stepping into a utopia where he was the undisputed master of every single cobblestone. In the corner of this warm, softly lit room stood the model maker. He was an older man, a quiet craftsman with thick spectacles and hands that were permanently dusted with a fine layer of white chalk. He wore a simple gray smock over his clothes, blending into the shadows cast by the towering lamps. To the powerful men who occasionally visited this room, the model maker was merely another piece of furniture, a silent tool used to bring their grand visions to life. But in his heart, he was the guardian of tiny, beautiful things. The model maker watched from the shadows as the dictator leaned over a vast, intricately detailed diorama of a new capital city. The miniature was a masterpiece of illusion. There were grand, sweeping boulevards made of smooth gray cardboard, wide enough to hold thousands of imaginary people. There were massive, domed halls carved from blocks of solid plaster, their tiny windows cut with agonizing precision by the model maker's own hands. There were little green trees made of dyed sponge, lining the avenues in perfect, unbreakable symmetry. It was a city without weather. It was a city without crying children, without cold winds, without hunger, and without fear. It was a sterile, beautiful ghost. The dictator reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the dome of the great hall. He murmured softly to his head architect, a low, hypnotic hum of words about scale, proportion, and the legacy of stone. The architect nodded, his eyes heavy with sleep, forcing a polite smile of agreement. They spoke of buildings that would last 1,000 years, their voices weaving a spell of permanence in a world that was rapidly turning to ash. The model maker listened to their hushed voices, his hands folded quietly in front of his apron. He looked at the tiny, perfect street lamps he had spent 3 entire days crafting from bits of wire and drops of clear resin. He had placed them exactly 1 inch apart, all the way down the Grand Avenue. As he stared at his tiny street lamps, he thought of the real street lamp outside his own apartment window, miles away in the sleeping, frightened city. That lamp had been broken for weeks. The glass was shattered, and the bulb was dark, leaving the street corner draped in a heavy, dangerous gloom. He slipped his chalk-dusted hand into the deep pocket of his smock, his fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper. It was a letter from his daughter, who lived in a neighboring town. He had read it so many times the creases were practically worn through. In the quiet darkness of his pocket, he traced the outline of the paper, recalling her soft, looping handwriting. She had written to him about the rain. She wrote that the roof of her small house had begun to leak, a steady, rhythmic drip that kept her awake at night. She described how she had placed a tin bucket on the floorboards, and how she sat in the dark, listening to the water ping against the metal, wrapping a woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders to keep out the chill. She wrote about trying to mend a pair of worn-out shoes with pieces of thick cardboard, hoping they would hold together just a little while longer. These were the fragile, beautiful struggles of her real life. Her letter was filled with the messy, desperate, enduring love of a person just trying to survive the winter. The model maker looked back at the table. The dictator was using a pair of silver calipers to measure the distance between 2 miniature monuments, his face a mask of serene, terrifying focus. He was entirely disconnected from the cold rain falling on the roofs of his people. He was lost in the warm, golden light of the desk lamps, insulated by the heavy silence of the room, planning avenues for a world that existed nowhere but in his own mind. The disconnect made the model maker's chest ache with a profound, quiet sorrow. He wanted to reach out and sweep his hand across the table, to knock over the plaster domes and crush the cardboard boulevards. He wanted to scream that real cities were cracking, that real roofs were leaking, that real people were shivering in the dark while they played with dollhouses in the light. But he did nothing. He stood perfectly still, his breathing slow and shallow. He was a survivor, and survival meant remaining a ghost. He took a deep, silent breath, anchoring himself to the memory of his daughter's face. He imagined her sleeping, wrapped in her woolen shawl, and he sent a quiet, desperate prayer out into the night, hoping it would find her and keep her warm. His everyday heroism was simply holding onto his love for her, refusing to let the cold, marble dreams of the men in this room turn his own heart to stone. The night dragged on, a slow, honeyed river of time. The grand clock on the wall ticked with a rhythmic, soothing pulse. More blueprints were unfurled. The sound of the heavy paper unrolling was like the rustle of dry autumn leaves. Brass paperweights, shaped like sleeping lions, were placed on the corners to keep the curling edges flat. The dictator picked up a soft lead pencil and began to sketch, tracing sweeping, impossible arches over the blue grids. The scratching of the graphite against the paper was a hypnotic, repetitive sound. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. The architects and adjutants standing around the table swayed slightly on their feet. The warmth of the room, the low, murmuring voices, and the lateness of the hour conspired to pull them toward sleep. They blinked heavily, trying to focus on the endless lines and curves. They were captive audience members in a theater of the absurd, forced to watch a man design a beautiful, sprawling roof for a house that was already burning to the ground. One of the younger architects, standing near the edge of the light, slowly reached up and pinched the bridge of his nose. Behind his closed eyelids, he wasn't seeing triumphal arches or grand plazas. He was seeing the face of his wife, illuminated by the soft glow of a kitchen fire. He remembered the smell of the simple soup she used to make, the warmth of the steam rising from the bowl. He remembered the way she would hum a quiet, tuneless song as she swept the floor. He missed her with a physical intensity that made his hands shake. He opened his eyes and stared at the plaster city, hating its perfection, hating its bright, unblemished whiteness. He forced his hands deep into his pockets so no one would see them tremble, wrapping his fingers around a smooth river stone he had picked up on a walk with his wife years ago. It was his talisman, a heavy, real piece of the earth, a counterweight to the weightless, floating fantasies spread out before him. As the hours bled away, the golden light of the lamps seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on the room like a physical blanket. The dictator's movements slowed. He would stare at a single miniature building for 10, 15 minutes at a time, lost in a trance, wandering the empty streets of his mind. The model maker leaned slightly against the wall, taking the weight off his tired feet. He watched the dust motes drift lazily through the beams of light. There was a strange, terrible beauty to the scene. If you didn't know the truth of the world outside, if you didn't know the cost of these dreams, you might look into this room and see only peace. You might see a dedicated artist, working late into the night, surrounded by his loyal friends, creating something beautiful out of nothing. But the model maker knew the truth. He knew that the plaster was just held together by water, and that the cardboard would easily tear. He knew that this room was not a workshop of creation, but a tomb where reality had been buried alive. Eventually, the deep, black window panes began to soften. The absolute dark gave way to a bruised, melancholic blue. The dawn was arriving, creeping over the jagged peaks of the mountains, over the silent forests, and over the rooftops of the sleeping, broken cities. The light in the architectural room seemed to suddenly grow pale and weak. The magic of the night was fading. The dictator finally set down his pencil. It rolled across the blueprint with a soft, hollow sound, coming to a stop against a brass weight. He stood up straight, pressing his hands into the small of his back, a sudden look of profound exhaustion washing over his face. The dream was over. The sun was demanding that they return to the waking world. He gave a brief, silent nod to the room, turned on his heel, and walked away. The heavy doors opened and closed, swallowing him back into the labyrinth of the house. The architects let out a collective, silent sigh. Shoulders dropped. Stiff necks were carefully rolled. The model maker stepped out of the shadows, his quiet duty beginning as theirs ended. He walked over to the great wooden tables. He picked up the brass lions, his hands moving with practiced, gentle efficiency. He rolled up the heavy blueprints, slipping them into long cardboard tubes, hiding the impossible drawings away in the dark. Then, he went to a linen closet and pulled out a stack of large, white dust sheets. He walked back to the miniature city. He looked down at the tiny boulevards, the perfect green sponge trees, and the little street lamps he had made. He thought of his daughter's leaking roof and the broken glass on his street corner. With a slow, sweeping motion, he threw the white sheets over the diorama. The fabric settled softly over the plaster domes and the cardboard streets, looking exactly like a heavy fall of fresh, silencing snow. The city was covered. The illusion was put to bed. The model maker walked around the room, clicking off the brass desk lamps one by one. Click. 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 The warm, golden light vanished, replaced by the cold, gray dawn filtering through the glass. He stood in the quiet gloom for a moment, wrapping his smock tighter around his body. The room was just a room again. He patted his pocket, feeling the reassuring crinkle of his daughter's letter. He turned and walked out into the cold, long corridors, stepping softly back into the real, beautiful, breaking world. In a world tearing itself apart, the steady rhythm of a typewriter key became a desperate heartbeat, keeping the silence at bay. Deep within the heavy, insulated walls of the mountain retreat, far from the grand marble halls and the sweeping views of the alpine valleys, there was a room that hummed with a different kind of energy. It was not a room of silent, waiting guards, nor a room of trembling generals. It was a cloistered, softly lit sanctuary that belonged entirely to the women. This was the domain of the private secretaries. If you were to stand outside their heavy wooden door, you would hear a sound that was at once mechanical and strangely musical. It was a ceaseless, fluttering cascade of clicks and clacks, underscored by the gentle, satisfying ring of the carriage return bells. It sounded like a heavy, summer rain falling against the tin roof. Inside, bathed in the warm, pooling light of brass desk lamps, sat a handful of young women, their fingers dancing across the round, black keys of their heavy iron machines. They were young, most of them drawn from quiet provincial towns, chosen for their unparalleled speed, their perfect grammar, and their absolute, unquestioning discretion. They wore simple, modest blouses, their hair neatly pinned back from their faces to keep it from brushing against the ink ribbons. In this strange, suffocating bubble of power, they had formed a tight, unbreakable sisterhood. They were a surrogate family, bound together by the extraordinary, surreal weight of their daily lives. The camaraderie in the typing pool was woven from small, unspoken gestures. When the air grew too heavy, or when the hours stretched long into the fading afternoon, one of the women would quietly rise from her desk. She would fill a small electric kettle, the soft hiss of the boiling water blending with the rhythm of the keys. She would steep chamomile or peppermint, pouring the pale, fragrant liquid into delicate porcelain cups. Without a word, she would set a cup down beside a fellow typist. The typist wouldn't stop working. Her eyes would remain fixed on her shorthand pad, her fingers continuing their relentless march across the keyboard. But the corners of her mouth would soften into a tiny, grateful smile. She would let the warmth of the tea radiate against her forearm. Later, when a particularly difficult page was finished, she would wrap her aching, ink-stained hands around the warm porcelain, closing her eyes and breathing in the scent of the herbs, letting it transport her, just for a moment, to a sunlit summer garden. They shared whatever small comforts they could find. A piece of hard chocolate, saved from a ration, would be broken into perfectly equal squares and passed silently from desk to desk. A glance across the room, a raised eyebrow, a shared, silent sigh, these were their lifelines. They understood, without ever having to say it aloud, the profound, dizzying disconnect of their existence. Their days were defined by the summons. The sudden ringing of the telephone, the quiet voice asking for the next girl in the rotation. When a secretary was called to take dictation, she gathered her thick, spiral-bound notebooks and her perfectly sharpened pencils with the solemn, practiced movements of a nurse entering a quarantine ward. She would walk down the long, carpeted corridors, her soft-soled shoes making no sound, and enter the study. There, she would sit in a straight-backed wooden chair, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. She was not a person in that room, she was an instrument, a vessel for the voice that paced back and forth across the thick rugs. The words would begin to flow, sometimes a slow, hesitating trickle, sometimes a roaring, unending flood. The topics were vast, sweeping, and often terrifying. There were words that moved invisible armies, words that reshaped the borders of the world, words heavy with consequence and shadow. But the young woman in the chair did not listen to the meaning. To listen to the meaning would be to invite the darkness inside, to let it crush her entirely. Instead, she survived through the brilliant, protective magic of dissociation. She focused entirely on the mechanics of her craft. She did not hear cities or strategies, she heard syllables and sounds. As the voice droned on, she translated those sounds into the elegant, sweeping geometry of shorthand. Her pencil glided across the rough paper, creating a secret, swirling landscape of loops, dashes, and sharp little hooks. A devastating command became nothing more than a graceful curve of graphite. A rambling, furious monologue was reduced to a neat, orderly row of abstract symbols. She built a fence of ink between herself and the reality of the room. She focused on the feeling of the wood pressed between. Her thumb and forefinger, on the soft scratching sound of the lead, on the precise moment she needed to flick her wrist and turn to a fresh, clean page. It was a strange, haunting normalization. She could sit in a sunlit room, a vase of fresh-cut alpine wildflowers resting gently on the table beside her, and transcribe the architecture of a nightmare, her breathing calm and steady, her face a perfect mask of polite attention. She survived by making the monstrous mundane. When the dictation finally ended, and she was dismissed, she would return to the typing pool. She would sit before her iron machine, thread a fresh sheet of paper beneath the roller, and begin the long process of translating her swirling graphite loops into neat, blocky type. The other women would not ask what she had heard. They never asked. They simply typed, their collective rhythm building a wall of sound that kept the silence, and the truth, safely at bay. But the true heart of these young women was not found in the documents they produced. It was found in the hours after the machines were finally covered with their heavy canvas hoods, when the ink was washed from their fingertips, and they retreated to their shared, private quarters. Here, the masks could finally be unpinned. The atmosphere in their bedrooms was profoundly different. The harsh, bright overhead lights were switched off, replaced by the soft, golden glow of small bedside lamps. The stiff collars of their blouses were unbuttoned. The heavy, sensible shoes were kicked off, leaving them to walk in stockinged feet across the floorboards. In these quiet, stolen hours, they scrambled desperately to hold onto the delicate threads of their ordinary lives. Imagine one of the younger secretaries, sitting cross-legged on her narrow bed. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the cold mountain night. In her lap rests a small, personal notebook with a floral cover. She is using her own pen now, a fountain pen with a nib that glides smoothly over the smooth, scented paper. She is writing a letter to her mother. After spending 10 hours typing words that will alter the course of history, she does not mention the war. She does not mention the pacing shadow, or the maps, or the endless, suffocating tension of the house. To write of those things would be to make them real, to let the cold wind of the mountain blow directly into her mother's warm kitchen. Instead, she writes of the spring thaw, She asks if the old cherry tree in the backyard has finally begun to blossom, painting the grass with tiny white petals. She writes about a stray cat she saw lingering near the kitchen doors, a little orange tabby that reminded her of the pet she had as a child. She writes about a pattern for a new dress she saw in a magazine, carefully describing the cut of the collar and the deep, ocean blue color of the fabric she hopes to find one day. She pours her entire soul into these trivial, beautiful details. She clings to the recipe for plum cake, to the gossip about a neighbor's new baby, to the mundane, rhythmic heartbeat of the world she left behind. As she writes, she brings the pen up to her lips, pausing to think of the right word. She can almost smell the yeast of her mother's baking bread. She can almost hear the familiar, comforting creak of the front porch step. The letter is her quiet rebellion. It is her everyday heroism. By refusing to let the darkness infect her private words, by stubbornly nurturing the memory of a peaceful, ordinary life, she is keeping a small flame of humanity alive inside a fortress of stone. Across the room, another secretary sits at a small vanity mirror, slowly brushing her hair. She pulls the silver bristles through her long, dark waves with a rhythmic, soothing motion. 100 strokes a night, just as her grandmother taught her. The repetitive motion is a meditation, a way to smooth out the tangled, anxious thoughts of the day. Sometimes, one of the women will sit behind another, taking the brush from her hands, and gently work out the knots for her. It is an act of profound, sisterly tenderness. The touch of another human being, gentle and undemanding, is a balm to their frayed nerves. They close their eyes, leaning back into the feeling of being cared for, pretending, just for a moment, that they are simply schoolgirls in a dormitory, with nothing heavier on their minds than a difficult exam or a weekend dance. As the night deepens, the soft scratching of pens slowly ceases. The letters are folded, slipped into envelopes, and tucked safely under pillows, ready to be mailed in the morning. The small bedside lamps are clicked off one by one, leaving the room bathed in the soft, silver light of the moon slipping through a crack in the curtains. From the darkness, whispered conversations float between the narrow beds. They talk about their brothers, their sweethearts, the holidays they used to take by the cold, gray sea. They build a fragile, invisible shelter out of their shared memories, hiding beneath it until sleep finally comes to claim them. The great house around them is still awake, humming with its dark, nocturnal anxieties. The guards still stand in the freezing shadows. The dictator still paces his floor. But in this one, quiet room, the heavy iron machines are silent. The symphony of typewriters is at rest. The young women breathe softly, dreaming of cherry blossoms and warm kitchens, their quiet resilience anchoring them to the beautiful, ordinary world that is waiting for them to return. To taste the perfect, buttered apple was to wonder, for one breathless second, if it might be your last. Far from the grand, sweeping maps and the heavily guarded doors, deep within the quiet, utilitarian heart of the mountain complex, there was a room composed entirely of white tiles and scrubbed wooden tables. It was a place that smelled of warm earth, boiling water, and melting butter. In any other time, in any other place, it would have been a room of profound comfort, a kitchen where the simple, beautiful alchemy of cooking brought people together. But here, the aroma of fresh food carried a heavy, invisible shadow. This was the room of the tasters. Outside these heavily guarded walls, the world was hungry. Across the continent, families were dividing meager rations, stretching a single loaf of dark bread to last the week, and dreaming of the meals they used to know. But inside this hidden fortress, there was an abundance that bordered on the surreal. The dictator did not eat meat, and so, from private, heavily guarded greenhouses, the very best of the earth was brought to this kitchen. There were tender, pale spears of asparagus, vibrant green peas plump with summer sweetness, and rich, golden cauliflowers bathed in thick, warm cream. There were bowls of clear, shimmering broths, and delicate apple strudels dusted with fine, white sugar. It was a feast fit for a king, but it was served to a small group of ordinary, terrified young women. They had been conscripted from the surrounding villages, pulled from their quiet lives as seamstresses, shopgirls, and daughters. They wore simple dresses, their hair pinned back, their hands resting nervously in their laps as they sat along the long wooden benches. They did not want to be here. They did not want to look at the beautiful, steaming plates of food that were set before them by the silent kitchen staff. Imagine one of these young women. She sits near the end of the table, staring down at a delicate porcelain bowl filled with vegetable stew. The steam rises in soft, lazy spirals, carrying the sweet scent of carrots and fresh herbs to her nose. Her stomach, young and naturally hungry, betrays her with a soft rumble. The body wants to eat. The body wants to be nourished. But her mind is gripped by a cold, quiet dread. She knows that poison is the great, unspoken fear of the man upstairs. And she knows that she, and the girls sitting beside her, are the human shields meant to catch it. She reaches out with a trembling hand and picks up her heavy silver spoon. She looks at her reflection in the polished metal, seeing her own pale face, her wide, dark eyes. She thinks of her mother's kitchen back home, a messy, joyful room where she used to sit on the counter and steal bites of raw dough. She remembers the way her mother would hum off-key while chopping onions, wiping her teary eyes with the back of a flour-dusted wrist. In that kitchen, food was an act of profound love. It was safety. It was warmth. Here, the act of eating has been twisted into something unrecognizable. She dips the spoon into the broth. She brings it to her lips. She closes her eyes, and she swallows. The stew is delicious. It is perfectly seasoned, rich and complex. But as the warmth spreads down into her chest, she does not feel comfort. She only feels the heavy, agonizing beginning of the weight. This is the true torment of the tasters. It is not the eating itself, but the long, silent hour that follows. Once the plates are cleared, the young women are not allowed to leave. They must remain in the white-tiled room, sitting together under the bright, unforgiving lights, while a large clock on the wall ticks away the minutes. Tick. Tock. Every swing of the pendulum is a question. Every minute that passes is a heavy, held breath. In this agonizing hour, the room becomes a sanctuary of quiet resilience. The girls do not panic. They do not cry out. They survive the waiting by leaning on one another, weaving a fragile net of human connection to catch themselves if they fall. The young woman who ate the stew feels a soft touch on her arm. The girl sitting next to her, a blonde with a scattering of freckles across her nose, gently takes her hand. Their fingers interlock beneath the wooden table, hidden from the eyes of the guards who stand by the door. The blonde girl leans in close, her voice dropping to a soothing, barely audible whisper. She doesn't talk about the food. She doesn't talk about the fear. Instead, she talks about a lake near her childhood home. She describes the way the water would turn a deep, sparkling sapphire in the late afternoon sun. She whispers about a small, wooden rowboat she used to take out on the water, letting the oars rest while she listened to the wind rustling through the tall reeds along the shore. She describes the smell of the damp pine needles, the sudden, joyful splash of a fish breaking the surface, and the feeling of the warm sun on her closed eyelids. The first young woman listens, closing her eyes again, letting the whispered words paint a picture in her mind. She focuses all her energy on the imaginary lake. She imagines dipping her hand into the cool, clear water. She matches her breathing to the slow, steady rhythm of the other girl's voice. Through this small, profound act of kindness, the blonde girl is offering her a life raft, pulling her away from the sterile, terrifying reality of the room and anchoring her to a beautiful, peaceful memory. They sit like this, hand in hand, trading whispered stories of ordinary lives. They talk about dances they used to attend, the crisp feel of a new winter coat, the smell of roasted chestnuts sold on a snowy street corner. They build a wall of beautiful, mundane memories to hold back the dark. And slowly, mercifully, the long hand of the clock sweeps around the dial. 40 minutes. 50 minutes. An hour. The hour passes. No one falls ill. No one collapses. The heavy, suffocating tension in the room breaks with a collective, silent exhale. Shoulders drop. The girls squeeze each other's hands one last time, a desperate, silent communication of relief. They have survived another meal. They are still alive. Only now, after the human toll has been paid, does the food finally leave the kitchen. The remaining portions are carefully packed into insulated, locked boxes, carried by grim-faced guards up the winding stairs, away from the white tiles and into the heavily carpeted, suffocating luxury of the main dining room. Upstairs, the atmosphere is entirely different, though no less fraught. The dining room is long and formal, dominated by a massive, polished table that gleams like a dark mirror under the light of crystal chandeliers. Heavy silver cutlery is arranged with geometric precision. Crystal water glasses sparkle. But despite the trappings of a grand banquet, the meal itself is a stark, ascetic affair. The dictator sits at the center of the table. For a man who commands empires, his plate is remarkably, obsessively simple. There are no rich sauces here, no grand roasts or complex pastries. He eats with a hurried, mechanical detachment, consuming clear, thin broths, plain mashed potatoes, and simple salads dressed only with a few drops of lemon and linseed oil. For him, eating is not a pleasure, it is merely a biological necessity, a rigid routine to be endured. And around him, forced to share in this bizarre, silent communion, sit his inner circle. The private secretaries, the same young women who spend their days typing his endless, looping monologues, are often required to join him for these meals. They sit with perfect, rigid posture, their hands folded neatly in their laps when they are not holding a fork. For them, the dinner is a tightrope walk over a quiet abyss. They have been given plates of the beautiful, rich vegetarian food that the tasters downstairs just survived. But they cannot show hunger. They cannot eat with too much enthusiasm, lest they draw attention to themselves. And they absolutely cannot make a sound. Imagine one of the secretaries, a young woman who has been awake since before dawn, her fingers still cramped from the heavy keys of her typewriter. She is exhausted, and she is genuinely, deeply hungry. A plate of perfectly steamed peas and buttery potatoes is placed quietly in front of her by a servant. She waits for the dictator to begin eating. Only then does she pick up her fork. She takes a tiny, deliberate bite. She chews with her mouth completely closed, her jaw moving with slow, agonizing care. She is terrified that the simple sound of her own teeth closing together might echo in the vast, silent room. If she accidentally scrapes her silver fork against the porcelain plate, the sharp, ringing clink feels like a physical blow. She would freeze, her heart leaping into her throat, praying that the man at the head of the table did not notice. The silence at the table is heavy and absolute. The dictator does not make small talk. He stares straight ahead, lost in his own sprawling, architectural dreams or military obsessions, his spoon methodically scooping up plain oatmeal or broth. The secretaries and adjutants sit like statues, their eyes fixed firmly on their own plates, studying the patterns on the china, watching the butter slowly melt into the potatoes. The young secretary focuses on the simple mechanics of swallowing. She forces the food down, though her throat is tight with anxiety. She remembers the joyful, chaotic dinners with her own family, where everyone talked at once, where plates were passed with laughter, and where a spilled cup of water was met with a joke, not a terrifying, breathless silence. She misses the noise. She misses the messiness of a normal life. She looks across the table and catches the eye of another secretary for just a fraction of a second. They do not smile. They do not nod. But in that fleeting glance, there is a shared, profound understanding. They are both enduring the same strange, gilded captivity. They are both eating the finest food in the world, and it tastes like ash in their mouths. The meal continues its slow, agonizing march. The grandfather clock in the hall chimes the hour, the deep, resonant notes vibrating through the floorboards. The servants move like shadows, clearing away the plates, pouring water, brushing away invisible crumbs, all without making a single sound. When the dictator finally lays his napkin on the table and stands, the relief in the room is palpable. The guests rise instantly, their chairs sliding back across the thick carpet with a soft whisper. The ordeal is over. Down in the depths of the complex, the young tasters are finally allowed to return to their simple quarters. They climb into their narrow beds, pulling the thin, woolen blankets up to their chins. They are exhausted, their bodies completely drained by the adrenaline of the day. The blonde girl with the freckles stares up at the dark ceiling, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the others in the room. She thinks again of the lake, of the wooden rowboat, and the warm sun. She pulls that memory tightly around herself, a protective cloak against the cold, stone reality of the mountain. She closes her eyes, grateful for the simple, beautiful fact that she is still breathing, and hoping that tomorrow, the lake in her mind will be just as blue, and just as peaceful, as it was today. Even the sky was stolen away, replaced by a heavy, artificial twilight woven from wire and painted leaves. Far from the crisp, thin air of the Bavarian Alps, the center of the dark world had moved east, settling deep into the ancient, brooding forests of the Masurian lakes. This was a landscape that did not welcome human life. It was a dense, tangled wilderness of ancient oak, birch, and sprawling pine, anchored in dark, waterlogged soil. The earth here was a massive, breathing sponge. To walk through these woods was to feel the dampness immediately sink into your bones, a heavy, suffocating moisture that clung to the skin and made every breath feel like drawing water into the lungs. They called it the Wolf's Lair. But to the men and women who were brought here to live and work, it did not feel like a lair. It felt like a sprawling, concrete tomb. The architecture of this place was born of absolute paranoia. There were no sweeping windows here to capture the beauty of the landscape. There were no grand marble halls. Instead, massive, windowless blocks of reinforced concrete crouched beneath the tree line, brutal and ugly. To hide these gray monoliths from the sky, the engineers had erected an immense canopy of camouflage netting. It stretched for acres, suspended on high wires, woven with strips of green and brown cloth, and embedded with fake, chemical-smelling moss. Beneath this artificial ceiling, the sun was banished. Whether it was noon or late afternoon, the compound was forever trapped in a sickly, green-tinged gloom. The natural light struggled to penetrate the nets, casting strange, shifting shadows across the damp ground. The trees themselves seemed to be suffocating under the weight of the wire. For the staff, stepping out of their concrete bunkers did not mean stepping into the fresh air, it simply meant trading the cold, damp stone for the warm, humid breath of the swamp. Imagine a young switchboard operator, a boy whose uniform always feels a size too small, standing outside the communications bunker. He has been given 10 minutes of respite from the flashing lights and the endless, buzzing voices on his headset. He leans against the rough, cold exterior of the concrete wall, hoping for a breeze. But there is no breeze. The air is entirely still, trapped by the netting overhead. He pulls at the collar of his woolen tunic. It is heavy and damp, smelling of old sweat and wet wool. In the humid air, nothing ever truly dries. Leather boots bloom with a fine, powdery white mold overnight. Paper wilts, becoming as soft and limp as old cloth. He wipes a bead of condensation from his forehead, but the moisture is immediately replaced by the oppressive heat of the forest. And then, there are the insects. They rise from the stagnant bogs that surround the compound in dark, swirling clouds. The endless, high-pitched whine of the mosquitoes is the true soundtrack of this place, a maddening hum that drills into the ears and frays the nerves. The young operator slaps his neck, leaving a small smear of blood on his fingertips. He smells the sharp, medicinal odor of the insect repellent they are all forced to wear, a scent that does little to stop the bites but completely ruins the taste of their food. He closes his eyes and tries to block out the buzzing. He tries to remember the feeling of being completely dry. He pictures his family's small farmhouse, sitting on a high, wind-swept hill. He remembers the way the summer wind would blow through the open windows, billowing the white linen curtains, carrying the scent of dry, golden wheat. He remembers taking off his boots and walking barefoot across the warm, sun-baked floorboards of the kitchen. He holds onto that memory with a desperate grip. In this dark, drowning forest, the memory of a dry summer breeze is a quiet, beautiful anchor. It keeps him from losing his mind to the swamp. He takes a deep, ragged breath of the heavy air, opens his eyes, and walks back into the cold, windowless block to plug back into a world that is slowly falling apart. Inside the bunkers, the atmosphere is a different kind of oppressive. The thick concrete walls offer protection from the sky, but they also trap the cold and the silence. The rooms are narrow, lit by bare, electric bulbs that cast harsh shadows into the corners. The ventilation systems hum constantly, a deep, vibrating drone that you feel in your teeth more than you hear with your ears. In one of the cramped typing pools, a young secretary sits before her machine. She is wrapped in a thick, woolen cardigan, despite the heat outside, because the interior of the concrete block is perpetually chilled, like the inside of a cave. Her fingers are stiff. The keys of her typewriter are sluggish, the delicate metal mechanisms rebelling against the constant, insidious moisture. She has just finished her shift. The long roll of dictation is done, the words of impossible campaigns and shifting borders locked away in their leather folders. Now, she is trying to write a letter home. She places a sheet of personal stationery on her small wooden desk. The paper feels damp and soft to the touch. She uncaps her fountain pen and begins to write. "Dearest mother," she traces. But the ink does not sit crisply on the page. The moisture in the paper catches the blue liquid, spreading it outward in tiny, feathery veins, blurring the edges of her letters. She pauses, letting out a soft, frustrated sigh. She carefully waves the paper in the air, a futile attempt to dry it in a room that has never known true warmth. She wants to tell her mother the truth. She wants to write about the claustrophobia that grips her chest every time she walks beneath the fake, knitting canopy. She wants to describe the pale, exhausted faces of the officers who pass her in the narrow corridors, men who no longer walk with the crisp arrogance of the early days, but who shuffle like ghosts carrying an invisible, crushing weight. She wants to say that she is frightened, not of the forest, but of the creeping, unspoken dread that has settled over the entire compound. The maps in the Situation Room are changing. The voices behind the closed doors are growing tighter, more frantic. The illusion of invincibility is slowly washing away in the damp air of the swamp, and everyone can feel it. But she cannot write these things. The letters are read. The illusion must be maintained, even in her own private words. So, she dips her pen again and forces a lie. She writes about the majesty of the ancient oak trees. She describes a deer she saw at the edge of the woods, a fleeting shadow of grace in the morning mist. She writes that she is eating well, that she is healthy, and that she hopes the garden back home is yielding a good harvest. As she writes, a shadow falls over her desk. She looks up to see one of the older clerks, a man with tired, kind eyes, holding out a small, folded piece of wax paper. He doesn't speak. He simply places the wax paper on the corner of her desk and gives her a small, encouraging nod. She carefully unfolds it. Inside is a small, precious chunk of camphor. It is meant to be burned to ward off the mosquitoes, but its sharp, clean scent is also a powerful remedy against the smell of the damp and the mold. It is a tiny, beautiful gesture. In a place designed entirely for the machinery of war, this small piece of camphor is a profound act of human grace. It says, "I see you. I know how hard this is. You are not alone." The young secretary looks up, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but the clerk has already turned away, walking softly back to his own desk. She brings the camphor to her nose and breathes in the sharp, piney scent. It clears her head. It cuts through the gloom. She smiles, a real, genuine smile, and turns back to her letter, her heart feeling just a fraction lighter. Her quiet resilience is fueled by this shared, silent understanding. They are all prisoners of the concrete canopy, but they will survive it by holding onto each other. For the man at the center of the labyrinth, the dampness and the gloom seemed strangely comforting. He rarely stepped outside the perimeter. He hated the sun, the snow, the open air. He preferred the artificial light, the thick, protective walls, the absolute control of his buried environment. He moved through the narrow concrete corridors like a pale, nocturnal creature, holding his endless, exhausting conferences while the swamp outside slowly swallowed the world. But for the rest of them, the longing for the open sky was a physical ache. The guards who manned the outer perimeter stood among the real trees, outside the edge of the camouflage netting. They were the only ones who could look up and see the true color of the heavens. But their posts were agonizing. They stood in the deep mud, surrounded by the swirling clouds of insects, forbidden to move, forbidden to swat at the bites that raised angry red welts on their faces and hands. Imagine one of these sentries, a farm boy from the southern valleys. The afternoon is dragging into evening. The heat has not broken, it has only thickened, turning the air into a warm, heavy soup. Sweat runs down his back, pooling uncomfortably beneath his heavy leather belt. He stands perfectly still, his rifle resting against his shoulder. He watches a massive, dark cloud slowly building on the horizon. It is a summer storm, rolling in across the eastern plains. He can smell the distant rain, a sudden, metallic tang cutting through the scent of the swamp. He prays for the storm to break. He wants the rain to come down in sheets, to wash away the stagnant heat, to drown the whining insects, to drum loudly against his metal helmet. He wants to feel the violent, beautiful chaos of nature, something raw and real to break the suffocating, engineered stillness of the compound. As the first, fat drops of rain begin to fall, splashing into the dark puddles around his boots, he does not flinch. He slowly tilts his head back, just a fraction of an inch, and lets the cool water hit his face. He closes his eyes and imagines he is standing in the middle of his father's pasture, letting the rain wash over him after a long day of cutting hay. He is not a guard outside a bunker. He is a boy in the rain. The storm breaks with a sudden, deafening crack of thunder, shaking the very roots of the ancient trees. The rain falls in a torrential, blinding sheet. Underneath the camouflage netting, the water gathers in heavy pools, occasionally breaking through the canvas and spilling down onto the concrete paths in sudden, muddy waterfalls. The compound becomes even darker, the artificial twilight turning into a premature, stormy night. The staff inside the bunkers pause in their work, listening to the muffled drumming of the rain against the thick concrete roofs. For a few minutes, the oppressive drone of the ventilation fans is drowned out by the sound of the storm. It is a moment of strange, collective relief. The rain is a reminder that the world outside still exists, that the sky is still up there, beyond the wire and the fake leaves. As evening truly falls, the storm passes, leaving the forest even damper, the air thick with rising mist. The shadows beneath the canopy deepen into an impenetrable black. The narrow, reinforced doors of the bunkers are pulled shut and locked tight against the night. Inside their small, shared quarters, the staff prepare for sleep. They hang their damp uniforms on wooden chairs, hoping the sluggish air will somehow dry them before morning. They check their boots for mold. They rub the soothing, camphor-scented salves onto their arms and necks. The young switchboard operator lies in his narrow bunk, staring at the concrete ceiling inches above his face. He listens to the breathing of his bunkmates. He reaches under his thin pillow and touches a small, smooth piece of sea glass he brought from home, feeling its perfectly rounded edges. The secretary folds her smudged letter, placing it carefully in an envelope. She looks at the tiny piece of camphor resting on her bedside table, a silent promise of kindness in the dark. The compound is silent now, save for the hum of the machines and the dripping of the rain from the nets outside. They are buried alive in the damp earth, trapped beneath a concrete sky, surrounded by a world that is slowly collapsing. But as they close their eyes, they do not dream of the bunker. They dream of open windows, of windswept hills, of blue lakes, and of the sun. They wrap themselves in the beautiful, resilient armor of their memories, holding onto the light until the morning comes. When the rest of the world surrendered to the gentle mercy of sleep, the night inside the mountain was just beginning. The grand clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep, resonant chime vibrating softly through the floorboards. In any ordinary house, this sound would be a final lullaby, a signal that the day's labors were done, and the house could finally rest. But in the dimly lit sitting room at the heart of the complex, time did not move in hours or minutes. It moved in words. The air in this room was incredibly heavy, thick with the scent of roasted coffee that had sat far too long in its silver pot, mingling with the dry, faint smell of old parchment, wool, and the dying, white-hot heat of the hearth. Deep in the plush armchairs, the audience sat perfectly still, trapped in a waking dream. The man at the center of the room did not want to sleep. The dark was not a comfort to him. It was a vast, terrifyingly empty space that he felt compelled to fill with the sound of his own voice. And so, he spoke. It was not a speech of state, nor a sudden, dramatic command that would echo across the continent. It was a slow, meandering river of thought, wandering aimlessly through the quiet valleys of his own past. He spoke of the grand architecture he had seen as a young man in Vienna, tracing the lines of imaginary buildings in the air with a trembling finger. He spoke of the proper way to train a German shepherd, of the diets of ancient philosophers, of the way oil paint dried on a canvas. The words looped and circled, returning to the same worn paths hour after agonizing hour. The voice was not a shout, it was a low, rasping, hypnotic drone that filled every corner of the room, leaving no space for silence, and no space for rest. For the men and women seated around him in the warm, pooling light of the lamps, the struggle was entirely invisible, but it was absolute. To fall asleep in that room was unthinkable. It was a failure of duty, an insult, a dangerous vulnerability. But the human body is a fragile, honest thing, and it aches for rest. Imagine the profound, physical weight of an eyelid at 3 in the morning. It feels as though it has been cast from solid iron. The air in the sitting room is warm and close. The voice is a steady, rhythmic hum, much like the sound of heavy rain against a window pane. Every muscle, every nerve, every bone in the body is crying out to simply let go, to surrender to the dark. In a high-backed chair near the wall, a weary adjutant sits with his hands folded perfectly in his lap. To look at him, you would see only rigid, unwavering attention. His uniform is immaculate, his posture straight. But behind his unblinking eyes, he is fighting a desperate, silent battle for his own consciousness. He feels a phantom chill creeping into his fingers and toes, the sudden cold that comes when the body believes it is time to shut down. He tastes the metallic, dry tang of exhaustion in the back of his throat. He knows that if he focuses on the words being spoken, the monotony will pull him under. So, he focuses his gaze on a single, glowing ember in the fireplace. He watches it pulse, shifting from a bright, angry orange to a dull, bruised purple, and finally to a soft, ash gray. To keep his mind tethered to the waking world, he begins to rebuild his childhood home in his memory, brick by silent brick. He visualizes the old wooden gate at the edge of his family's property. He imagines the exact sound it made when it swung open, a high, squeaking protest of rusted hinges. He mentally walks up the gravel path, counting the smooth, white stones. 1, 2, 3. He paints the front door in his mind, remembering the exact shade of chipped, faded green paint, and the brass handle that was always cold to the touch. He remembers the smell of the damp lilac bushes that grew beneath the front window. He wraps himself tightly in these mundane, beautiful details. He uses the memory of a quiet, ordinary life as a shield against the crushing exhaustion of the present. He is a soldier, But his everyday heroism in this room is simply the act of remembering his mother's garden, holding on to a world that made sense while the world around him slowly loses its mind. Beside him, separated by only a few inches of thick carpet, sits one of the private secretaries. She is so deeply tired that her vision has begun to blur. The edges of the room are softening into a hazy, golden watercolor wash. She has been taking shorthand dictation since the early hours of the morning, her fingers cramped and stained with graphite. Now, in the deepest, most unnatural part of the night, she is required simply to exist as an audience, a quiet captive to the midnight monologue. She stares at the rim of her delicate porcelain teacup, which has long since grown cold. She tries to count the tiny, painted blue flowers on the china, but the flowers seem to detach themselves from the cup, floating and spinning in her vision. She feels the terrifying, slow dip of her chin. It is a microscopic movement, a fraction of an inch, but it feels like falling from a great height. The warm, dark tide of sleep is rising up from the floor, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her under. She dreams, for a split second, of a soft, feather pillow. She smells clean linen. She is slipping away. Just as her eyelashes flutter and begin to close, she feels a tiny, barely perceptible pressure against the side of her shoe. The adjutant beside her has shifted his foot, just a hair's breadth, pressing the polished leather of his boot against the side of her sensible heel. It is not a kick. It is not a sudden jolt. It is a gentle, steady, life-saving tether. The slight pressure anchors her back to the waking world. She takes a sharp, silent breath through her nose, her spine instantly straightening. Her eyes snap wide open. She does not turn her head to look at him. She cannot risk the movement. But beneath the shadow of her long woolen skirt, she gently presses her shoe back against his for a single, lingering heartbeat. It is a silent, desperate thank you. In this room of shadows, surrounded by the heavy machinery of power and the endless, looping words of a man terrified of the dark, this tiny point of physical contact is a profound act of human grace. It is two human beings holding each other up, sharing the impossible weight of the night. They are surviving together, connected by a fraction of an inch of leather, an unspoken pact to keep each other safe. The hours crawl forward, as slow and heavy as freezing water. 2 o'clock. 3 o'clock. 4 o'clock. The voice continues, a low, rasping murmur that seems to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the bones of the listeners. The words lose all meaning, becoming a wash of sound, a bizarre symphony of syllables that blend into the ticking of the grandfather clock. The captives in the chairs learn to sleep with their eyes open. They master the terrible, necessary art of the waking coma. They let their minds detach from their exhausted bodies, floating somewhere near the ceiling, looking down at themselves sitting in the soft, suffocating chairs. They think of their families. They think of the wind. They long for the sun with a primitive, aching desperation. They pray for the quiet rotation of the earth, begging the dawn to hurry. And then, finally, the subtle shift begins. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn perfectly tight against the glass, but the atmosphere in the room senses the change. The absolute, suffocating blackness of the night outside begins to thin. A pale, hesitant gray light touches the edges of the alpine peaks. The birds hidden in the ancient pines awaken, beginning their first, tentative songs, a sound that manages to pierce even the thick, reinforced walls of the house. The man in the center of the room feels the arrival of the dawn. The deep, primal fear that kept him speaking through the night slowly begins to ebb, chased away by the approaching light. His sentences begin to trail off. He loses his train of thought, staring blankly into the cold, gray ashes of the fireplace. The endless loop is finally, mercifully broken. He stands, his movements stiff and sudden, brushing a speck of invisible dust from his sleeve. He offers a brief, murmured dismissal to the room, barely acknowledging the exhausted souls who have kept his shadows at bay. He turns and walks slowly toward his private chambers, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a soft, final click. The relief in the room is not a sudden, joyful thing. There are no smiles, no whispered celebrations. It is simply a slow, hollow exhaling of breath. The captives rise from their chairs. Their bodies ache with a profound, vibrating soreness. Their joints are stiff, their eyes dry and burning. They do not look at one another. They simply move like ghosts out into the long, carpeted corridors. The early morning daylight is bleeding through the high windows now, casting long, pale beams across the floor. To the exhausted staff, the light is overwhelmingly beautiful. It is the color of freedom. They walk to their small, quiet bedrooms. They are too exhausted to wash their faces, too tired to even unbutton their collars or take off their shoes. The young secretary simply falls forward onto her narrow bed, pulling the woolen blanket over her shoulders. The adjutant sits on the edge of his mattress, burying his face in his hands for a long, silent moment, letting the silence of the room wash over him like a healing balm. They close their eyes at last. They sink instantly into the dark, welcoming, dreamless waters of sleep, grateful for the fragile peace of the morning. They are free for a few precious hours, allowed to rest in the quiet sanctuary of their own minds, until the sun eventually sets, and the long, endless night demands them once again. Even the heaviest shadows are cast by bodies made of fragile, failing bone. Behind the heavy, reinforced doors of the inner sanctum, far away from the sprawling maps and the endless, clicking typewriters, there was a room that smelled entirely different from the rest of the mountain fortress. It did not smell of polished leather, or floor wax, or the sharp, metallic tang of fear. It smelled of rubbing alcohol, crushed dried leaves, iodine, and the clean, sterile scent of boiling water. This was the medical dispensary, a quiet, white-tiled sanctuary where the illusion of absolute power came to be quietly, secretly repaired. The morning ritual in this room began long before the sun had managed to pierce the thick canopy of the surrounding forests. It began with the soft, comforting sounds of a young medical orderly preparing for the day. He was a quiet young man, with gentle hands and a face that still held the soft, unlined innocence of a medical student. He moved through the small room with a practiced, soothing grace. He filled a shallow, stainless steel tray with water and set it over a small blue flame. Into the water, he carefully laid the heavy, glass syringes and the long, hollow silver needles. He stood and watched the water come to a boil. The soft, rhythmic clattering of the glass against the metal was a peaceful, domestic sound, reminding him of his grandmother boiling jars in her country kitchen, preparing to preserve the late summer peaches. He loved the simplicity of this task. In a world that had become impossibly complicated and terrifyingly dark, the act of sterilizing a piece of glass was a pure, honest thing. It was a tiny, perfect corner of order that he could control. He watched the steam rise, clouding the small vanity mirror above the sink, and allowed himself to breathe in the warm, clean air. Presently, the heavy door opened with a soft sigh, and the personal physician entered. The physician was an older man, his face deeply lined, his eyes hidden behind thick, round spectacles. He carried a worn, black leather medical bag that seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. He moved with the slow, exhausted shuffle of a man who was carrying a secret he could no longer bear, yet was forbidden to put down. He offered the young orderly a tired, silent nod and walked to the small table in the center of the room. He unclasped his leather bag, laying out a bizarre, colorful array of small glass vials. The orderly watched him from the corner of his eye. This was not the medicine the young man had studied in his textbooks. There were amber liquids, pale pink solutions, and strange, murky mixtures that the physician brewed himself. It was a desperate alchemy, a daily performance of dubious miracles designed to keep a crumbling monument standing just a little while longer. The physician carefully snapped the fragile glass neck of an ampoule, the sound a sharp little click in the quiet room. He drew the liquid into a warm, sterile syringe. His own hands, the orderly noticed, were steady, but his shoulders were bowed under an invisible, crushing weight. He was a healer who knew, deep in his heart, that he was no longer healing. He was merely painting over the rust. Then, the heavy footsteps sounded in the carpeted corridor outside. The door opened, and the man who commanded the continent stepped into the sterile light of the clinic. To the millions of people outside, he was a towering, terrifying voice echoing from the radio, a rigid figure of iron and will. But here, in the quiet, merciless light of the medical room, the terrifying illusion dissolved. Here, he was simply a patient, and a deeply failing one at that. The orderly stood perfectly still, his eyes respectfully lowered, but he could see the profound unraveling of the man's physical form. The broad shoulders that once filled out the immaculate uniforms were now stooped and hollow. The skin, untouched by the natural sun, was the color of old parchment, bruised with deep, violet shadows of absolute exhaustion beneath the eyes. He shuffled forward, his footsteps dragging slightly against the white tiles. But the most glaring, heartbreaking sign of the collapse was the left hand. It trembled. It did not just shake with the slight tremor of age or fatigue, it vibrated with a relentless, uncontrollable energy, like a dry leaf caught in a freezing wind. The man tried desperately to hide it. As he walked into the room, he pressed the trembling hand hard against his side, burying it deep in the heavy fabric of his trouser pocket, or clutching the thick lapel of his uniform jacket until his knuckles turned entirely white. In this room, the trembling hand was the loudest thing in the world, yet it was surrounded by a suffocating, absolute silence. The unspoken rule of the daily consultation was a forced, collective blindness. The physician did not look at the hand. The orderly did not look at the hand. They kept their eyes focused strictly on the patient's face, or on the glass syringes, or on the white tiles of the floor. To acknowledge the tremor would be to acknowledge the mortality of the immortal leader. It would be to admit that the center of the world was fracturing, breaking apart at the seams. And so, they played their quiet, tragic parts in the theater of denial. The man sat heavily in the leather examination chair, offering a muted, rasping greeting. The physician stepped forward, his voice a low, soothing murmur as he asked gentle, meaningless questions about the quality of the man's sleep and the state of his digestion. The answers were always the same: complaints of insomnia, of phantom pains, of a deep, unshakable weariness. The physician wiped a small circle of cool, stinging alcohol onto the pale skin of the man's arm. The orderly watched as the needle breached the skin, delivering the mysterious, colorful fluids into the bloodstream. It was an astonishing, intimate moment of vulnerability. The architect of so much suffering, sitting quietly in a chair, entirely dependent on the strange, colored water provided by an exhausted old man. For a few moments after the injection, the room remained perfectly still. The clock on the wall ticked with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Then, the artificial magic would begin to take hold. The stimulant would rush through the tired veins. The man would sit up a little straighter. A false, fleeting flush of color would return to his pale cheeks. He would take a deeper breath, his eyes briefly clearing of the heavy fog of exhaustion. For a few hours, the chemical courage would hold the trembling at bay. He would stand up, adjust his tunic, and walk out of the clinic with a renewed, terrible energy, ready to return to his maps and his endless, midnight monologues. The heavy door would close, and the medical room would instantly exhale. The physician would slump back against the counter, removing his thick spectacles and pinching the bridge of his nose. The orderly would step forward, silently gathering the used glass syringes, the empty, broken ampoules, and the blood-spotted cotton swabs. As the orderly stood over the sink, rinsing the delicate glass instruments under the warm water, he felt a deep, quiet sadness settle into his chest. He was not sad for the man who had just left the room. He was sad for the gentle art of healing. He thought of his grandfather, a retired country doctor who had spent 50 years riding a horse-drawn carriage through the snowy valleys, carrying a worn leather bag just like the physician's. His grandfather had not used mysterious pink liquids or powerful, dangerous stimulants. He had set broken bones with smooth wooden splints. He had sat through the night holding the hands of feverish children, placing cool, damp cloths on their foreheads until the fever broke with the dawn. He had traded his skills for a basket of fresh eggs, or a loaf of warm, dark bread, and a grateful, genuine smile. That was true medicine, the orderly thought. It was an act of profound, everyday heroism, rooted in kindness and the simple, honest desire to ease human suffering. What they were doing here, in this secret, windowless room, was the exact opposite. They were not curing an illness, they were merely fueling a fever. They were propping up a collapsing structure, terrified of what would happen when the final, inevitable crash occurred. The orderly dried the glass syringes with a soft, white cloth, placing them carefully back into their velvet-lined case. He slipped his hand into his uniform pocket, his fingers touching a small, folded piece of paper. It was a letter he had been writing to his grandfather in his mind for weeks, a letter he knew he could never actually send. "Dear grandfather," he would write, "I am keeping the instruments perfectly clean, just as you taught me. But the sickness here is not in the blood, and it cannot be reached by a needle. I watch a man try to hold the world together with a hand he cannot even control. I long for the smell of the pine trees after a rainstorm. I long to see a patient smile because they are truly getting well, not just because they have forgotten their pain for a single hour." He held onto the imaginary letter like a protective talisman. It kept his own heart soft in a building made of cold concrete and fear. He looked over at the older physician, who was staring blankly at the wall, lost in the heavy labyrinth of his own impossible responsibilities. The orderly walked over to a small cabinet and retrieved a clean, porcelain cup. He poured a measure of hot water from the kettle and steeped a simple, honest blend of dried chamomile and mint. He walked over to the physician and gently placed the warm cup on the table beside him. The older man blinked, startled from his dark thoughts. He looked down at the fragrant tea, and then up at the young orderly. He didn't say a word, but his tired eyes softened, offering a fleeting, profound look of gratitude. In the heart of the collapsing empire, surrounded by the bizarre rituals of false medicine, this simple cup of tea was the only real healing that took place that morning. It was a quiet, human acknowledgement of shared exhaustion, a small moment of grace between two men trapped in the shadows. The orderly returned to the sink to finish wiping down the pristine white tiles. The clinic was immaculate once more, smelling only of clean water and dried mint. The glass vials were locked away. The illusion was prepared for another day. But as the orderly worked, he listened to the distant, muffled sounds of the complex above them, knowing with the absolute, quiet certainty of a true healer that no matter how many injections were given, the trembling had already spread far beyond that one, fragile hand. The fever had broken, and the long, slow collapse of the mountain had finally begun. To command a ghost, one only needs a small piece of colored wood and a very quiet room. Deep within the damp, concrete labyrinth, beneath the heavy canopy of artificial leaves and the silent, watchful pines, there was a room entirely dedicated to the shape of the world. It was the Situation Room, a wide, low-ceilinged bunker dominated by a single, massive oak table. The air here was always warm, heated by the brilliant, pooling light of a dozen brass lamps that hung low over the wood. It smelled faintly of dry paper, graphite, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar shavings. This was the heart of the daily ritual. Every afternoon, the heavy wooden doors would open, and the men who carried the weight of the continent on their shoulders would silently file in. They wore immaculate uniforms of thick, gray wool, their brass buttons catching the light. But despite the polish of their boots and the medals on their chests, they did not walk like conquerors. They walked with the slow, careful steps of men navigating a frozen lake, terrified that the ice was about to shatter beneath their feet. They gathered around the heavy table, bowing their heads slightly as the great maps were unrolled. The sound of the thick, creamy parchment unfurling was a soft, sweeping rustle in the quiet room. Brass weights, shaped like small, sleeping lions, were placed on the corners to keep the heavy paper flat. On these maps, the world was neat. The world was orderly. There were gentle blue lines for rivers, soft green shading for forests, and sharp, dark borders that could be redrawn with the simple stroke of a colored pencil. Then, the dictator would enter. The room would hold its collective breath. He would step up to the table, his eyes fixed on the paper landscape, completely ignoring the men who stood in the shadows around him. With a trembling hand, he would reach out and pick up a small, painted wooden block. These blocks, colored red and blue, were meant to represent thousands of living, breathing men. He would push a blue block across a drawn river. He would murmur a command, his voice a low, hypnotic drone, ordering an advance, dictating a sweeping counterattack. To listen to his voice, you would think the forests were full of fresh soldiers, and the roads were paved with endless supplies. You would think the world outside the bunker was exactly as perfectly controlled as the paper on the table. But the men standing around the edge of the light knew the truth. The silence in the room was not just the silence of respect, it was the suffocating, agonizing silence of a shared, unspeakable lie. Imagine an older general, standing directly across from the dictator. His face is deeply lined, a map of its own, weathered by decades of service and sorrow. He looks down at the blue block that has just been pushed across the paper river. He knows that the men that block represents are gone. They were lost weeks ago in the deep snow, scattered to the freezing winds, their letters home left unwritten, their voices silenced forever. He stares at the little piece of painted wood. It is a terrible, heartbreaking object. To the man moving it, it is a victorious army. To the old general, it is a ghost. It is a paper army, marching in the dust of a delusion. The general feels a sudden, profound tightness in his throat. A desperate urge rises within him to reach across the table, to sweep the wooden blocks onto the floor, to shout that the map is a lie, that the lines are broken, that the boys are never coming home. But he does not speak. He swallows the truth, burying it deep in his chest until it aches. He knows that to speak reality into this room is to invite a terrifying storm, to shatter the delicate glass bubble that the dictator has built around himself. To survive the physical toll of this silence, the old general retreats inward. He shifts his gaze slightly, looking away from the painted blocks and focusing instead on a single, tiny mote of dust floating lazily in the beam of the brass lamp. He watches it drift, weightless and free. He closes his eyes for a fraction of a second and thinks of his garden back home, nestled in a quiet valley far from the war. He remembers the feeling of the rich, damp earth on his hands. He thinks of the rose bushes he planted with his wife many springs ago. He remembers the way she would carefully prune the thorny branches, her face serene, humming a gentle, tuneless melody. He imagines the soft, velvety texture of a red petal caught between his fingers. He holds onto the memory of that garden like a drowning man holding onto a piece of driftwood. It is his sanctuary, a quiet place of truth and life that the madness of the map room cannot touch. His everyday heroism is simply holding onto his sanity, preserving a small flame of love in a room consumed by a beautiful, terrible fiction. At the far end of the table, standing just outside the circle of bright light, is a young adjutant. He is barely out of his teenage years, his uniform still fresh and unworn. His duty is to manage the colored pencils. He holds a small, wooden box filled with carefully sharpened leads, crimson red, deep ocean blue, and sharp, striking black. He smells the cedar wood of the pencils, a scent that reminds him vividly of his school days, of sitting at a scarred wooden desk and trying to solve simple math problems while looking out the window at the passing clouds. The young adjutant watches the older men around the table. He sees the rigid set of their jaws. He sees the exhausted droop of their shoulders. He sees the tragic, quiet pantomime they are forced to perform. He pities them. He realizes, with the sudden, quiet wisdom that comes to the very young in dark times, that power is sometimes just a prison made of expectations. He reaches his free hand deep into the pocket of his woolen trousers. His fingers trace the edges of a small, smooth coin. It is a simple copper piece, practically worthless, but to him, it is the most valuable thing in the world. His little sister gave it to him the day he left for his assignment. She had pressed it into his palm, her small face serious, and told him it was a lucky charm to keep the monsters away. As the dictator's voice drones on, outlining an impossible fantasy of moving non-existent divisions across the paper plains, the young adjutant rubs his thumb over the face of the copper coin. He imagines his sister playing in the tall grass behind their house, her laughter bright and clear, chasing a yellow butterfly into the summer breeze. He wraps his heart in her innocence. He listens to the quiet scratching of a red pencil on the thick map, and he tells himself that the map is just a drawing, the room is just a room, and the only thing that is truly real is the warm copper in his pocket and the love of a little girl waiting for him to return. The conference drags on, time stretching into a slow, agonizing crawl. The impossible orders are laid out. The phantom armies are arranged. The dictator finally steps back from the table, looking up at his silent generals. The room waits, suspended in a breathless tension. He is waiting for agreement. He is demanding that the men in the room validate the illusion, that they take the lie and make it real. The old general, his mind returning reluctantly from the quiet garden of his memories, looks at the man across the table. He sees the trembling left hand, hidden clumsily behind a military posture. He sees the desperate, wild certainty in the sunken eyes. The silence is a heavy, physical weight. Someone must bear it. Yes, my Führer, the old general whispers. The words are spoken so softly they barely disturb the air, but they echo in the hearts of everyone in the room. It is the sound of a soul quietly bending, a tragic surrender to the darkness. The other officers murmur their agreement, a ripple of hushed, hollow compliance. The spell is complete. The paper armies have been officially recognized. The dictator nods, satisfied, and turns away. He shuffles toward the heavy wooden doors, leaving the room without looking back. The doors open and close with a soft thud, sealing him safely back inside the labyrinth of his own mind. The instant he is gone, the atmosphere in the situation room fractures. The unbearable tension snaps. The officers let out long, shaky breaths. Shoulders slump in a collective, silent exhaustion. They look at the map on the table, at the bright blue marks and the little wooden blocks, and the profound tragedy of the afternoon settles over them like fine, gray ash. They do not look at each other. They cannot bear to see their own shame reflected in the eyes of their comrades. The young adjutant steps forward into the light. He moves with a quiet, gentle respect, gathering the colored pencils and placing them back into their wooden box. He picks up the little painted blocks, scooping the phantom armies into his hands, taking them off the battlefield and returning them to the dark. The old general places his hands on the heavy brass lions and lifts them from the corners of the map. He slowly rolls the thick parchment, the dry rustle of the paper sounding like a final, fading sigh. He places the rolled map into a leather tube, closing the lid on the fantasy. The brass lamps are clicked off one by one, plunging the oak table back into the shadows. The men turn and walk toward the exit, their boots scuffing softly against the floor. They are returning to their small, cold rooms, carrying the impossible burden of knowing the truth in a world that demands a lie. They step out into the damp, echoing corridors of the bunker, holding tightly to their lucky coins and their memories of quiet gardens, hoping only for a few hours of dreamless sleep before the paper armies must be resurrected in the dust all over again. There is a kind of grace that only an animal can bring into a breaking world, a quiet innocence that knows nothing of maps or men. Just beyond the heavy, suffocating concrete of the bunkers, where the artificial camouflage netting finally gave way to the true, open sky, there was a small clearing in the woods. It was a modest patch of damp earth, surrounded by ancient, towering pines that dropped their soft needles onto the forest floor. Here, the air did not smell of floor wax or fear. It smelled simply, beautifully, of the wild. It smelled of wet bark, turning leaves, and the deep, rich breath of the earth. And every day, For a brief, stolen window of time, this clearing became the stage for the most profoundly surreal moment of the dictator's routine. It began in the quiet of the kennels, a short distance from the main compound. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different from the sterile, terrifying corridors of the high command. Here, the air was warm with the scent of clean straw, fresh water, and the comforting, musky smell of animal fur. This was the domain of the dog handler. He was a young man, chosen for his quiet demeanor and his gentle, steady hands. In a world that demanded rigid obedience and sharp salutes, the handler moved with a slow, forgiving grace. He did not care for politics or the grand, terrifying movements of phantom armies. He cared only for the creatures in his charge. He unlatched the heavy wooden gate of the pen, and a beautiful German shepherd stepped out to greet him. She was a magnificent animal, her coat a rich tapestry of deep black and warm, toasted gold. Her ears were perfectly pitched, her dark eyes bright and intelligent, completely unclouded by the sorrow of the human world. To her, the concrete fortress was just a den, and the men in uniform were just strangers passing by. She knew nothing of the war. She knew only the simple, binary truths of her existence: hunger and fullness, cold and warmth, sleep and play. The handler knelt on the concrete floor, ignoring the dampness seeping into the knees of his trousers. He took a soft bristle brush and began to run it slowly down the length of her back. The dog leaned into his touch, letting out a low, rumbling sigh of pure contentment. As he brushed her, the young man allowed his mind to wander away from the shadows of the compound. He closed his eyes and felt the rhythmic motion of his own hand, listening to the soft scratching sound of the bristles against the thick fur. He thought of his childhood home, a small, sloping farm at the edge of a wide, green valley. He remembered the old sheepdog they used to have, a tangled, messy creature who would sleep by the hearth and chase the blowing leaves in the autumn. He remembered the pure, uncomplicated love he felt when that old dog would rest its heavy chin on his knee. It was a love that required no words, no oaths of loyalty, no terrifying sacrifices. It simply was. He reached into his pocket and touched a folded piece of paper. It was a letter from his younger sister, written in her careful, looping handwriting. She had written to tell him that a stray cat had taken shelter in their barn and had just birthed a litter of tiny, blind kittens. She described how she had made them a bed out of an old woolen blanket, and how the mother cat purred when she brought her a saucer of warm milk. The handler held onto that image, the soft woolen blanket, the purring cat, his sister's gentle hands. In a place dedicated to destruction, his everyday heroism was simply this: tending to the innocent, brushing the dog's coat, and keeping the memory of a warm, peaceful barn alive in his heart. He was a guardian of small, beautiful things in the shadow of a giant darkness. When the coat was gleaming and free of dust, the handler reached for the leash. It was made of thick, supple leather, worn soft from use, with a heavy brass clasp that gleamed in the dim light of the kennel. He clipped it to the dog's collar with a soft, metallic snap. "Come along, then," he whispered, his voice a low, soothing murmur. They walked together out of the kennels, leaving the concrete paths and stepping onto the soft, yielding earth of the forest. The dog's demeanor changed instantly. Her nose dropped to the ground, pulling in the million invisible stories written in the damp soil. Her tail wagged with a loose, joyful rhythm. The handler let the leash run out a little, allowing her the freedom to explore the edges of the path. For these few minutes, walking beneath the trees, the young man felt a profound, aching sense of peace. The oppressive weight of the compound vanished. He was no longer a soldier in a terrible machine. He was just a boy taking a dog for a walk in the woods. He breathed in the cold, sharp air, watching the dog freeze, her ears swiveling to catch the sound of a distant, hidden bird. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, grateful for the beautiful, simple reality of the animal beside him. They arrived at the clearing and stood at the edge of the tree line, waiting in the dappled, shifting light. Presently, the heavy iron door of the bunker in the distance opened, and a figure stepped out into the daylight. The handler tightened his grip on the leather loop of the leash. He watched the man approach. He saw the hunched shoulders, the pale, drawn face, the heavy, dragging footsteps of a mind exhausted by its own terrible designs. The dictator looked like a man carrying a mountain on his back, his eyes fixed on the ground, oblivious to the beauty of the pines and the soft blue of the sky above. But then, the man looked up and saw the dog. And in that singular moment, the handler witnessed a transformation so profound, so bizarre, that it made his blood run cold. The heavy, suffocating mask of the warlord simply vanished. The rigid posture melted away. The man's face softened, the deep lines of exhaustion smoothing out into an expression of genuine, unfettered delight. He clapped his hands against his thighs and called out, his voice losing its harsh, rasping edge, becoming high and soft, almost childlike. The German shepherd barked, a bright, happy sound that echoed through the quiet trees. The handler unclipped the heavy brass clasp. The dog bounded across the clearing, an arrow of muscle and joy, throwing herself at the man. The dictator sank to his knees in the damp grass, completely ignoring the mud staining his immaculate trousers. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in her warm fur. He murmured soft, cooing words, words of endearment and gentle affection. The dog licked his face, her tail wagging furiously, completely oblivious to the hands that were holding her. From the shadows of the tree line, the young handler watched this quiet, playful reunion, a heavy knot forming in his chest. This was the terrible paradox of the clearing. He watched the man's left hand, the same hand that trembled violently in the medical clinic, the same hand that pushed the painted wooden blocks across the maps, sending thousands into the dark, rest gently, perfectly still, on the dog's head. The tremor was gone. The hand simply stroked the soft ears, scratching the sweet spot behind the collar, moving with a tender, practiced rhythm. The handler wrestled with a profound, dizzying cognitive dissonance. How could a heart be so entirely compartmentalized? How could a man order the burning of the world, only to step outside and throw a wooden stick for a dog with such pure, uncomplicated joy? He watched the dictator pick up a fallen pine branch and throw it across the clearing. The dog scrambled after it, her paws tearing up clumps of damp moss, returning the stick with a proud, panting grin. The man laughed. It was not the dry, rattling laugh of the cinema room, but a real, ringing sound of amusement. The handler closed his eyes for a moment, unable to reconcile the laughter with the silence of the map room. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to run, to take the dog and disappear into the deep, endless woods, away from the madness of this fractured soul. But he remained rooted to the spot, his boots planted firmly in the earth. He realized that he could not understand the man, but he could protect the dog. He opened his eyes and focused entirely on the animal. He watched the way her muscles rippled beneath her coat. He watched the joy in her eyes when she caught the stick. He mentally drew a circle of safety around her, vowing to keep her fed, to keep her brushed, to make sure her water bowl was always full and cold. He could not stop the war, but he could make sure this one, innocent creature felt nothing but love and warmth. He thought of the people in the cities far away, the people shivering in the dark, and he sent a silent, helpless apology out into the universe. He knew it wasn't enough, but it was all he had. He held onto his humanity by refusing to look at the dictator, focusing solely on the dog, anchoring his own soul to her unblemished spirit. The minutes ticked by, suspended in a strange, golden bubble of peace. The sun shifted, casting longer, cooler shadows across the grass. The dog, finally tiring, trotted back to the man and sat heavily by his side, leaning her weight against his leg, her tongue lolling out in a happy, exhausted pant. The dictator rested his hand on her head one last time. He looked out at the trees, his eyes seeming to focus on something far away, something beyond the forest. And then, as quickly as it had vanished, the dark, heavy mantle fell back over his shoulders. The softness disappeared from his face. The jaw tightened. The terrible, invisible weight returned to his back. The unguarded moment was over. The world was demanding his attention once again. He gave the dog a final, brief pat, stood up slowly, and turned his back on the clearing. The handler stepped forward out of the shadows, the leather leash coiled in his hand. He walked softly across the damp grass, kneeling beside the dog. She looked up at him, her eyes bright, waiting for his gentle touch. With a soft, metallic click, he fastened the brass clasp back onto her collar. The spell was broken. The leash was taut. The dictator walked across the clearing, a solitary, darkening figure moving back toward the heavy iron door of the bunker. He did not look back. The door opened, revealing the sickly, yellow electric light of the concrete corridors, and then swallowed him whole. The handler stood up, gently tugging the leash. The German shepherd looked back at the trees, her ears swiveling to catch the sound of the wind one last time, before turning to follow. They walked back toward the kennels together, the young man and the dog, leaving the clearing to the silence of the woods. The handler felt the heavy leather strap in his hand, a physical tether binding the innocence of the animal to the madness of the mountain. He walked with his head down, thinking of his sister's letter, thinking of the purring cat in the barn, and hoping, with a quiet, desperate resilience, for a day when the dark would finally break, and all the leashes could simply, mercifully, be let go. The sky had become a memory of blue, locked away behind 50 feet of unyielding, gray concrete. As the world above dissolved into a landscape of fire and falling ash, the center of all things began its final, slow descent into the earth. The mountain retreat, with its sweeping alpine views and the scent of pine needles, was gone. The grand marble halls of the city were now hollow shells, their glass eyes shattered by the thunder of the horizon. Life had contracted. It had pulled inward and downward, shrinking until it existed only within a cramped, airless labyrinth of reinforced stone, buried deep beneath the ruined gardens of the capital. This was the bunker. A world where the sun never rose, and the moon never set. To step down the narrow, spiraling concrete stairs was to feel the weight of the entire world pressing in on your chest. The air changed instantly. It lost the movement of the wind and the freshness of the rain, becoming something thick, heavy, and stagnant. It smelled of damp chalk, stale tobacco, diesel fumes, and the sharp, clinical sting of ether. In this subterranean twilight, time did not flow like a river, it pooled like dark water in a cave. Day and night blurred into a single, continuous hum. The only heartbeat in this concrete tomb was the low, rhythmic thrumming of the ventilation fans, a sound that never ceased, vibrating through the floors and into the very bones of those trapped within. In the middle of this suffocating gloom, a young nurse named Elsa moved through the narrow corridors. She was a woman of quiet grace, her white uniform kept impossibly crisp and clean despite the dust that seemed to seep through the very pores of the walls. She carried a small tray with a single glass of water and a clean linen cloth. Elsa was not a strategist or a secretary of state. She was a guardian of the small, fragile remains of human comfort. In a place built for the machinery of an ending, her duty was to maintain the illusion of care. She walked past the heavy, airtight doors, her rubber-soled shoes making a soft, rhythmic squeak against the linoleum. She saw the men in the hallways, officers whose uniforms were now wrinkled and stained, their eyes wide and bloodshot from lack of sleep. They leaned against the concrete walls, staring at nothing, their hands trembling as they lit cigarettes with matches that flared too bright in the dim light. They looked like ghosts waiting for a carriage that would never arrive. Elsa did not look at their rank or their medals. She looked at the way their shoulders slumped. She looked at the way they bit their lips. As she passed a young courier sitting on a wooden crate, his head buried in his hands, she paused. She didn't speak, words were too heavy for the thin air of the bunker. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. It was a brief, light touch, as fleeting as a moth's wing. But beneath the rough wool of his jacket, she felt the boy's entire body shudder. He didn't look up, but he reached out and briefly squeezed her hand, his fingers cold and damp. In that silent exchange, the concrete tomb was breached by a sudden, breathtaking wave of human warmth. It was Elsa's everyday heroism, to refuse to be turned to stone, to offer a piece of her own calm to those who were drowning in the dark. She continued her descent into the lower levels, where the air grew even tighter. Here, the dictator's private quarters were tucked away, small rooms with low ceilings that felt as though they were slowly shrinking. The dictator was no longer the man of the mountains. He had become a creature of the chalk. He spent his hours pacing the narrow confines of his study, his footsteps a repetitive, dragging sound that could be heard through the thin partitions. He moved from the desk to the wall, from the wall to the desk, a trapped animal in a cage of his own making. The light in his room was always the same, a harsh, flickering electric glow that carved deep, skeletal shadows into his face. Elsa entered to bring him his water. She watched him as he stared at a small, framed portrait of his mother that sat on the desk. For a moment, the pacing stopped. The trembling of his left hand, which had become a constant, violent rhythm, seemed to quiet. He looked at the painted face of the woman from a long-dead world, and for a heartbeat, Elsa saw not a warlord, but a lost, frightened child looking for a way home. She set the tray down with a soft, careful clink. She didn't stay. She was a ghost in his presence, a silent witness to the unraveling. She stepped back into the corridor, her heart aching with a strange, weary pity that she dared not name. She realized that the bunker was not just a physical space, it was a state of mind, a final, airless room where the past and the future had finally collided. To keep her own mind from fracturing, Elsa sought out the other women. In the small, cramped kitchen area, the secretaries and the cooks gathered around a single, dim bulb. They sat on crates or leaned against the humming refrigerators, their knees touching in the tight space. They were a sisterhood of the subterranean, bound together by the shared knowledge that the world above was ending. They spoke in whispers, their voices blending with the drone of the fans. They didn't talk about the maps or the thunderous thuds of artillery that occasionally shook the concrete. They talked about the smell of lilacs in the spring. They talked about the way the light used to hit the lakes in the late afternoon, turning the water to liquid copper. One of the older cooks, a woman with flour-dusted arms and a face like a dried apple, pulled a crumpled letter from her pocket. It was a letter from her son, written months ago from a farm far to the west. She read it aloud, her voice a low, soothing melody in the cramped room. He wrote about a cow that had just calved, and about how the grass was growing so fast you could almost hear it. The women listened, their eyes closed. For a few minutes, the gray concrete walls vanished. They were standing in a sun-drenched field. They could feel the warmth of the sun on their skin and smell the sweet, heavy scent of new clover. They were breathing real air. This was their quiet resilience. They built a cathedral of memories to shield themselves from the tomb. They shared a single, precious piece of hard candy, passing it around like a sacred relic, letting the sugar melt slowly on their tongues, a tiny, defiant spark of sweetness in a world of ash and chalk. When Elsa returned to the medical station, she found the young orderly she worked with. He was sitting at a small table, meticulously cleaning a set of surgical instruments. He worked with a focused, desperate intensity, as if the cleanliness of the steel could somehow ward off the chaos outside. Elsa sat beside him and began to fold bandages. They worked in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft clatter of the metal and the rustle of the linen. "Do you think the sun is out today?" the boy asked suddenly. His voice was thin and cracked. Elsa looked at the gray, sweating walls. She looked at the heavy, reinforced door that led to the stairs. She thought of the ash-colored sky she had seen before descending. The world turned to a ghost of itself. But she looked at the boy's face, at the fear in his young eyes, and she chose a different truth. "Yes," she whispered, her voice like a gentle bedtime story. "The sun is brilliant today. It's a pale, clear gold. The wind is blowing through the ruins of the garden, and it's carrying the scent of the first blossoms. If you listen very closely, beyond the fans, you can hear the birds. They haven't forgotten how to sing. The boy took a long, shaky breath and nodded. He closed his eyes, and a small, fragile smile touched his lips. He believed her because he had to. Elsa went back to her bandages, her own heart heavy with the weight of the lie, but steady. She was a nurse in a tomb, and if she could not provide a cure, she would provide a dream. She would stay awake in the humming twilight, keeping the small flames of kindness burning until the very end. The night, or what passed for night, deepened. The pacing in the dictator's room slowed and finally stopped. The lights in the corridors were dimmed, leaving the bunker in a thick, charcoal gloom. The staff curled up on cots or tucked themselves into corners, seeking a few hours of escape and sleep. Elsa stayed at her station, a single small lamp casting a golden circle over her hands. She listened to the deep, rhythmic breathing of the bunker, the sound of 100 hearts beating against the concrete. She felt the massive weight of the earth above her, the descent into the chalk complete. But as she closed her eyes for a moment of rest, she didn't see the gray walls. She saw a field of lilacs, swaying in a gentle, warm wind, and she held on to that image as if it were the only thing in the world that was true. Music has a way of finding the cracks in a stone heart, humming a tune that the concrete cannot silence. Deep within the damp, echoing chambers of the subterranean world, a strange and fragile theater was beginning to unfold. Outside, the world was a landscape of fire and falling masonry. The sky over the city had turned into a permanent, bruised twilight, thick with the smell of brick dust and the bitter tang of iron. But down here, past the heavy airtight doors and the weeping concrete walls, a small room had been transformed into a place of impossible, desperate celebration. This was the canteen, a narrow, low-ceilinged space that usually smelled of cabbage and floor wax. But tonight, it smelled of something far more precious and far more fleeting. It smelled of expensive French perfume, spilled red wine, and the sweet, lingering smoke of the last fine cigars. In a world where the future had been erased, the present moment became a blazing, frantic sun. At the center of the room, perched on a small wooden table, sat an old gramophone. Its brass horn caught the dim, flickering electric light, glowing like a piece of fallen moon. A young woman, a secretary whose hands were still stained with the ink of the morning's last hopeless dispatches, reached out with a trembling finger. She carefully lowered the needle onto the spinning black disc. There was a moment of expectant, electric silence. Then, a soft, rhythmic scratching filled the room, the sound of history turning on a spindle. And finally, the music arrived. It was a waltz, thin and tinny, the violins sounding like they were calling from a very great distance, across a sea of years that no one in the room could ever hope to cross. As the melody drifted through the heavy, stagnant air, the people in the room began to move. It was a slow, surreal dance of ghosts. Officers in uniforms that had seen better days took the hands of young nurses and secretaries. They moved with a meticulous, exaggerated grace, as if by maintaining the steps of the dance, they could hold the crumbling walls in place. They spun in tight circles, their shadows dancing large and grotesque against the gray concrete. Imagine a young lieutenant, barely 20 years old. His boots are polished to a mirror shine, but his eyes are fixed on a point far beyond the room. He is dancing with a girl from the typing pool, a quiet girl with a sprig of dried lavender pinned to her collar. As they waltz, the floor beneath their feet suddenly shudders. Thump! Thump! It is the sound of the world ending. The heavy, muffled vibration of artillery fire strikes the earth far above, traveling down through the 50 feet of soil and stone to rattle the glasses on the tables. The chandeliers sway, the crystals tinkling together with a delicate, terrifying sound. For a heartbeat, the music is drowned out by the thunder of the horizon. But the dancers do not stop. They do not even look up. They simply tighten their grip on one another's hands. The young lieutenant looks down at the girl. He sees a single, stray hair that has escaped her pin, resting against her forehead. He sees the way her pulse flutters at the base of her throat. In this moment of tragic absurdity, he realizes that the girl is the only real thing left in his universe. She is warm, she is breathing, and she smells of lavender and soap. He closes his eyes and lets the waltz take him away. He is no longer in a bunker. He is back in a village hall on a midsummer night, with the doors wide open and the scent of jasmine blowing in from the fields. He is just a boy who loves a girl, and for the duration of the record, the war is a lie. This was their quiet, desperate resilience. They were not celebrating a victory, they were celebrating the fact that they could still feel the warmth of another person's skin. They were drinking the last bottles of champagne not because they were happy, but because they were thirsty for a world that no longer existed. At a small table in the corner, an older man, a clerk who had spent his life filing papers in triplicate, sat alone. He held a glass of dark, heavy wine, watching the red liquid swirl against the crystal. He felt the vibrations of the shells in his very marrow. Each thud was a reminder that the circle was closing, that the distance between the music and the fire was shrinking with every passing hour. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph of his wife. She was standing in a sunny kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, laughing at something he had said just as the shutter clicked. He looked at her smile, and then he looked at the sweating, gray walls of the canteen. The contrast was a physical pain, a sharp blade in his chest. A young nurse, seeing him sitting alone, walked over and sat down. She didn't ask him why he was sad, she knew the answer. Instead, she reached out and gently covered his hand with hers. Her hand was small and steady. "The record is almost over," she whispered. Her voice was as soft as a falling leaf. "Shall we put on another?" The clerk looked at her, and the tightness in his throat loosened just a fraction. He nodded, unable to speak. He realized that this nurse, with her tired eyes and her gentle touch, was performing an act of profound, everyday heroism. She was standing in the middle of a nightmare and offering a stranger a piece of her own peace. They sat together in silence, two small boats tethered together in a rising storm, finding a strange, hollow comfort in the shared knowledge of what was coming. Near the gramophone, the dictator's personal projectionist stood by the wall. He was the man who had spent years spinning illusions of light and shadow for the man in the front row. Now, he watched the real-life theater of the canteen. He saw the way the laughter in the room was a little too loud, a little too brittle. He saw the way the men held their glasses, their knuckles white with a tension they couldn't name. He looked at the spinning record. He saw the needle slowly marching toward the center, toward the end of the song. It was a metaphor for all of them. They were all on a track, moving toward a final, silent groove. The music changed. The waltz ended, and a new song began, a slow, melancholy ballad about a soldier saying goodbye to his sweetheart under a lamppost. The singer's voice was rich and sad, vibrating with a longing that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the bunker. One of the secretaries, a girl who had lost her brother only weeks before, suddenly stopped dancing. She stood in the middle of the floor, her shoulders shaking, the tears finally breaking through the mask of forced merriment. She didn't sob, she simply wept, the tears rolling down her cheeks and dripping onto the dusty floor. The room didn't fall silent. The other dancers didn't stop. But the lieutenant from the first dance gently stepped toward her. He didn't offer words of comfort, words were useless now. He simply wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a protective embrace. He held her as the singer on the record sang about the lamppost and the long walk home. He stood there like a pillar of salt, absorbing her grief into his own uniform, while the music spun around them like a silk ribbon. This was the surreal truth of the final days. The bunker had become a place where the most profound human emotions were squeezed into the smallest spaces. In the absence of a future, the past became a vibrant, living thing. They clung to the melodies of their youth, to the tastes of fine wine, and to the touch of a hand, because those were the only things the concrete couldn't take away. The night wore on, a long, honeyed descent into the dark. The artillery fire grew louder, the thuds coming faster now, shaking the dust from the ceiling onto the heads of the dancers. The air in the canteen grew thinner, used up by the many breaths and the flickering candles. Eventually, the bottle of wine was empty. The cigars were stubs. The candles sputtered and died, leaving the room in a thick, charcoal gloom. The gramophone needle reached the final groove of the last record. The music stopped, replaced by a rhythmic, hypnotic scratching. Scritch. 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 The dancers slowly pulled apart. They stood for a moment in the half-light, looking at one another with the startled, blinking eyes of people waking from a fever. The waltz was over. The lamppost was dark. The reality of the concrete walls rushed back in, cold and unyielding. They began to file out of the canteen, their footsteps heavy and tired. They walked back to their narrow cots, back to the humming fans and the scent of damp chalk. They moved through the corridors like shadows returning to the wall. The young nurse helped the older clerk to his feet. The lieutenant walked the secretary back to her room, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. They didn't speak of the celebration. They didn't speak of the fire above. They simply focused on the next step, the next breath, the next hour of survival. In the empty canteen, the gramophone continued to spin. The needle stayed in the center, tracing the same circle over and over again, a small, lonely sound in the heart of the tomb. The whispers over the gramophone had faded, leaving only the silence of the ash and the steady, relentless heartbeat of the fans. But as the staff closed their eyes to sleep, the melody of the waltz still hummed in their blood, a fragile, beautiful ghost of humanity that the world above could not burn. In the deepest, coldest hour of the night, a single pen scratched against paper, the only sound left in a world that had forgotten how to breathe. Deep within the subterranean silence of the concrete tomb, the air had grown so thin it felt as though it might snap like a thread of glass. The frantic music of the canteen had long since faded. The clinking of glasses and the hollow laughter of the dancers had been swallowed by the shadows, leaving behind a stillness so absolute it felt like a physical weight against the skin. Above, the city was a sea of fire and falling stone, but down here, in the small, windowless study, the only reality was the pooling light of a solitary desk lamp and the rhythmic, rasping breath of an ending. A young woman sat at the edge of a hard wooden chair, her back straight despite the crushing weight of 1,000 sleepless hours. Her name was Trottle, but in this moment, she was simply the witness. She was the vessel. Her eyes, red-rimmed and burning with exhaustion, were fixed on the spiral-bound notebook resting in her lap. Her fingers, stained with the soft gray dust of graphite, clutched a sharpened pencil with a grip that turned her knuckles white. She was waiting for the voice. Across from her, the dictator sat hunched in the shadows. He was no longer a man of iron, he was a ghost made of parchment and trembling bone. The light of the lamp did not reach his face, leaving him a silhouette against the weeping concrete wall. The left hand, his constant, shaking companion, was buried deep in the folds of his dark tunic, but the vibration of it seemed to thrum through the floorboards, a secret, frantic heartbeat in the dark. Then, the voice began. It was not the thunderous roar that had once filled the great stadiums. It was a low, dry whisper, the sound of dead leaves skittering across a stone floor. The words came slowly, haltingly, as if they were being pulled from a deep, stagnant well. He began to dictate his final will and testament, a last, desperate attempt to capture the chaos of a lifetime and pin it to a page. Trottle's pencil began to move. Her hand acted with a life of its own, a mechanical grace born of years of habit. She did not listen to the meaning of the words. She could not. To understand the weight of what was being said, the cold justifications, the lingering bitterness, the final, terrifying farewells, would be to let the darkness drown her. Instead, she focused on the geometry of the shorthand. She watched the loops and the hooks, the sharp descents and the soft, rising curves of the graphite. She made the tragedy into art. She turned the end of an era into a neat, orderly row of symbols. As she wrote, her mind drifted, seeking sanctuary in the small, beautiful things of her past. She thought of a spring morning in her childhood home, when the air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. She remembered the way the sunlight would catch the dust motes dancing in the kitchen, turning them into a swirling galaxy of gold. She remembered the sound of her mother's humming, a soft, tuneless melody that promised safety and the simple, quiet continuity of life. She thought of the letters she had written to her family, letters filled with small lies about her well-being, about the mountain air, about the meals she had eaten. She realized now that those letters were her true testament. They were the evidence that she had tried to stay human in a place that demanded she be a shadow. A single, hot tear escaped her eye, rolling slowly down her cheek and landing on the paper, blooming into a small, dark star against the white. She didn't wipe it away. She simply adjusted her grip on the pencil and continued to write, her quiet resilience a silent prayer in the gloom. The dictator paused. The silence rushed back into the room, heavy and expectant. In that pause, Trottle looked up. For a heartbeat, her gaze met the silhouette in the chair. In the dim, flickering light, she saw the profound, hollow fatigue etched into the man's form. She felt a sudden, weary pity, not for the leader, but for the soul trapped in the wreckage of its own making. It was a tragic, human moment, a secretary and her employer, two exhausted people sitting in a hole in the ground, waiting for the end. She saw a small, framed photograph on the desk, not of a general or a monument, but of a dog. She remembered the handler in the woods, the gentle way he brushed the golden fur, and the way the dog would lean into his touch with a sigh of pure contentment. She held on to that memory of animal innocence. It was a reminder that even in the heart of the bunker, the memory of love and simple, uncomplicated life still had the power to flicker. The dictation resumed. The voice grew thinner, the sentences shorter, as if the man were running out of air. He spoke of his marriage, a brief, surreal ceremony that had taken place just hours before in the humming twilight of the corridor. He spoke of the loyalty of those who remained, a quiet acknowledgement of the people who had followed him into the dark. Trottle felt the pencil growing heavy in her hand. Her wrist ached with a dull, throbbing heat. She felt the physical toll of her loyalty, the way her own youth had been used up to document this long, slow descent. But she did not fail her. She owed it to the paper, she told herself. She owed it to the silence. She would finish the task, not out of belief, but out of a desperate, human need for completion. The final words were spoken. They hung in the stagnant air for a moment before vanishing into the shadows. "That is all," the whisper said. The dictator stood up, his movements stiff and jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. He did not look at her. He did not thank her. He simply turned and walked toward the small, private room where his new wife was waiting, the heavy door closing with a soft, final click. Trottle was alone in the study. The lamp flickered, the light casting long, trembling shadows across the desk. She looked down at her notebook. The pages were filled with the elegant, swirling patterns of her shorthand, a secret language of sorrow. She felt a profound, hollow relief. The burden of the voice was gone. The words were captured, locked in the ink, and now she was free to simply be herself again. She stood up, her joints popping in the silence. She walked over to the small vanity mirror in the corner and looked at her reflection. She saw a young woman with ink on her fingers and a tired, beautiful face. She saw the resilience in her own eyes, a quiet flame that the concrete could not extinguish. She reached into her pocket and found a small, embroidered handkerchief her grandmother had given her. It smelled faintly of lavender and old trunks. She used it to wipe the ink from her fingertips, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. It was a ritual of cleansing, a way to reclaim her own body from the machinery of the bunker. She gathered her notebooks and her pencils, hugging them to her chest. She walked out of the study and into the narrow, gray corridor. The air was still thick with the smell of diesel and damp chalk, and the ventilation fans continued their low, rhythmic hum. But as she walked toward her small, shared bedroom, she felt a strange, light peace. She passed a young guard standing by the stairs. He was leaning against the wall, his eyes closed, his face pale in the dim light. Trottle stopped. She reached out and gently touched his arm, a soft, human gesture that required no words. The guard opened his eyes and looked at her, and for a second they shared a look of profound, mutual understanding. They were both ghosts in the machine, but they were still alive. "Go to sleep, Carl," she whispered. The guard nodded, a small, tired smile touching his lips. Trottle continued on her way, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the floor. In her room, she crawled into her narrow cot, pulling the thin woolen blanket up to her chin. She did not think of the testament. She did not think of the fire above or the fire that was coming. She thought of the mountain. She thought of the way the mist would roll down the peaks in the early morning, and the way the sun would turn the snow to diamonds. She thought of the dog in the clearing, chasing a stick through the damp moss. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the fans become the sound of the wind in the pines. She drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, her quiet heart beating steadily in the dark, a small, stubborn anchor of humanity in a world that had finally, mercifully, fallen silent. When the heavy, iron heartbeat of the world finally stopped, all that remained was the sound of the dust settling against the stone. Deep within the earth, the silence was no longer a thing of tension or a held breath. It was a vast, echoing hollow, a space where a great and terrible weight had suddenly, inexplicably vanished. The air in the corridors of the bunker, which for weeks had been thick with the scent of stagnant hope and diesel fumes, now felt strangely light, as if the concrete itself were finally exhaling. The low, constant hum of the ventilation fans continued, but it no longer sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like a long, fading sigh, a mechanical lullaby for a world that had ceased to exist. In the small rooms where the secretaries and nurses had waited for the end, there was a strange, suspended stillness. The typewriters sat covered in their heavy canvas hoods, their silver bells silent, their ribbons dry. The maps in the Situation Room remained unrolled, the brass lions still guarding borders that had long since dissolved into the smoke. On a small wooden table, a single porcelain teacup sat cold and empty, a tiny blue flower painted on its rim looking up at the gray ceiling with a quiet, unblinking indifference. The people who remained moved through this silence like ghosts. They did not speak in the hushed, terrified whispers of the day before. They spoke with the flat, tired voices of those who have seen the sun go down for the last time and are surprised to find themselves still breathing. They gathered their small belongings, a photograph, a worn letter, a piece of soft woolen cloth, not with the frantic energy of escape, but with the slow, deliberate grace of people packing away the remnants of a dream. Imagine a young nurse, her white apron smudged with the gray dust of the chalk walls, standing at the bottom of the long, concrete staircase. She holds a small, battered leather suitcase in one hand. Inside, tucked between her few changes of clothes, is a sprig of dried lavender she has kept since the mountain. She closes her eyes and listens to the silence of the bunker. She realizes that for the first time in years, she is not waiting for a bell to ring. She is not waiting for a summons or a shout. The shadow that had governed every second of her life, every movement of her hands, every thought in her head, has simply evaporated. She feels a strange, cold lightness in her chest. It is not joy, and it is not yet grief. It is a hollow relief, a dizzying sense of being cast adrift in a world without a shore. She takes a deep, ragged breath, the first real breath she has taken in months, and begins the long, slow climb toward the light. One by one, they followed her. The secretaries, the cooks, the orderlies, and the weary guards who had stood as statues in the dark. They climbed the narrow, spiraling stairs, their footsteps scuffing softly against the reinforced stone. The air grew cooler as they rose, losing the smell of the machine and gaining the sharp, bitter scent of the world above. When they finally pushed open the heavy, reinforced door and stepped out into the garden of the chancellery, the world they found was unrecognizable. The garden, which had once been a place of manicured lawns and blooming roses, was a landscape of ash and twisted iron. The sky above was a bruised, melancholic gray, filled with the drifting soot of 1,000 fires. The sun was a pale, flickering ghost behind the smoke, casting no shadows. There were no birds here. There was no wind. There was only the sound of the city burning in the distance, a low, rhythmic thudding that felt like the earth itself was trying to settle back into place. But as the survivors stood in the ruins, something miraculous began to happen. The young nurse looked down at her feet. There, pushing through a crack in the scorched stone, was a single, tiny blade of green grass. It was impossibly bright against the gray of the ash. She knelt in the dust, her fingers trembling as she touched the soft, living silk of the plant. It was a sign that the earth did not care about the maps or the monologues. It was a reminder that life, in its quiet, stubborn resilience, was already beginning to return. She looked around at her companions. They were standing in the smoking light, their faces pale and streaked with soot, their eyes wide as they took in the devastation. But they were also looking at each other. Without the shadow between them, they saw one another clearly for the first time. They saw the tired lines around the eyes, the gray in the hair, the simple, honest humanity of people who had survived a nightmare. An older clerk, the man who had carried the wooden button in his pocket through the marble halls, walked over to a young secretary who was shivering in the cool morning air. Without a word, he took off his heavy woolen coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was a simple, quiet act of kindness, a small moment of heroism in a world of ruins. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears, and she reached out to take his hand. They stood together in the ash, two small, fragile boats anchored to one another in the middle of a sea of gray. They began to walk away from the bunker, moving slowly through the skeletal remains of the city. The streets were filled with the wreckage of a civilization. There were overturned trams, shattered glass that looked like fallen stars in the gutter, and the hollow shells of buildings that stared at them with empty, blackened eyes. But even here, in the heart of the fire, the human spirit was stubbornly alive. They passed a woman sitting on a pile of rubble, her hair covered in a white scarf. She was using a small stick to stir a tiny fire in a tin can, heating a measure of water. Beside her sat a young child, playing with a small, wooden horse, the same kind of horse the guard in the forest had carved for his daughter. The child laughed, a clear, bright sound that cut through the heavy silence of the street. The survivors stopped to watch. They saw the woman reach out and stroke the child's hair, her face soft with a love that the war had been unable to touch. They realized that this was the true world, not the grand marble halls or the sweeping plans for a 1,000-year empire, but this. A mother, a child, a small fire, and a wooden toy. The everyday heroism of simply continuing to love. As the morning progressed, the gray smoke began to lift, revealing a pale, watery blue sky. A gentle wind began to blow, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. It was a quiet, forgiving wind, washing away the smell of the chalk and the diesel. The survivors reached the edge of the city, where the ruins gave way to the first hints of the countryside. They stood on a small hill, looking back at the smoking silhouette of the capital. They thought of the people they had left behind, the dog in the clearing, the model maker with his chalk-dusted hands, the cook who read the letters from the farm. They felt a profound, aching sorrow for the world that had been lost, but they also felt a growing, quiet strength. The young nurse looked at her hands. They were no longer the hands of a servant to a shadow. They were her own hands. She thought of the sick she would heal, the children she would one day hold, and the garden she would plant in a world that was finally at peace. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the sprig of lavender, letting the wind catch the tiny purple flowers. She watched them drift away, falling softly into the ash, a small piece of the mountain returning to the earth. "It's over," she whispered. Her voice was not a shout of triumph. It was a gentle, soothing truth. The others nodded, their faces turning toward the horizon. They began to walk again, their steps rhythmic and steady on the long, winding road. They were no longer walking through the corridors of a tomb. They were walking into the dawn of a new world, a world that would be built not of concrete and fear, but of small kindnesses, shared memories, and the quiet, enduring resilience of the human heart. The silence of the ash was not the end. It was a beginning, a soft, gray blanket under which the seeds of the future were already starting to wake. And as they walked, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, golden shadows across the road, guiding them home through the beautiful, breaking, and ever-hopeful world.